listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for another week of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America in the independent corner. I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am your indefatigable, ever-vigilant, burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good morning, everybody. It's just past 7 a.m. Eastern. It is November 15th, midway through the month now, preparing to head next month, of course, into the last month of this year. An eventful year, I will add, following on from last year's also very eventful year. Just pausing to reflect on that for a second. I mean, really, in a month and a half, we'll have an opportunity to truly reflect on the year as it ends tomorrow, but we're getting pretty close to it, and 2020, 2021 have been crazy, am I right?
Yeah, I mean, 700-some thousand deaths from a virus? Yeah, that by itself, I mean, that's just one thing.
Just by itself?
Yeah.
But then I'll put it like this. I'd like to remind myself, 2020 started out with the assassination of Soleimani. Started out, if I recall correctly, the Puerto Rico earthquake that just devastated. Am I not misremembering things? I think that was late December 2019, like right at the end. The world was still recovering from it. Qasem Soleimani got assassinated. My dad had a big old, it wasn't a stroke at the time, but he went to the hospital early last year, and then coming out of that, this COVID thing started to break. Then we, just personally for us, last year, we switch over. Suddenly we're doing this show.
Yep.
That's interesting.
Out of the blue, yeah.
Out of the blue. And then earlier this year, you have January 6th. Of course, an election last year, a bunch of people call it disputed.
Yeah.
And earlier this year, you have January 6th. COVID's continuing. I mean, so far this year's
still in the wake of January 6th. I mean, they're still doing investigations and whatnot. Man, that brings up memories. I mean, the gates, they were basically here in D.C. You basically had D.C. in flames at one point.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. It's been a wild year.
That's the last 2 years. And then if you go 5 years, suddenly we're back in like the origins of Trump, Russiagate, and all of the crazy culture war stuff kicking off. And anyway, that you know the meme with the dog in the room that's on fire, and it's like nothing's wrong, everything is fine. That's kind of what a lot of people have been like, I'm sure. Anyway, I've been delaying long enough. I'll get into headlines now. First up in COVID news, yesterday in the United States, there were 25,411 new COVID cases reported, along with 464 deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 80,885 cases per day. That's an increase of 11% from the average 2 weeks ago. 50% of the total American public has now been fully vaccinated. 68% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 47,036,751 people across the United States. Here in the U.S., it's killed 761,980 people. In national news, 500 National Guard troops have been set on standby as attorneys in the Kyle Rittenhouse case prepare to make their closing arguments today. The troops are stationed outside of Kenosha, Wisconsin, ahead of a possible verdict. Closing arguments will be given for up to 5 hours today, and the jury of 8 men and 10 women will be narrowed to 12 by a drawing of names. A federal grand jury has returned an indictment against former Donald Trump advisor Steve Bannon for contempt of Congress over his defiance of a subpoena from the Select Committee investigating the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol. The indictment sets off what will likely be a contentious legal battle with significant ramifications for the January 6th committee as it seeks to compel other witnesses to testify about the events leading up to the attempted insurrection, quote unquote, earlier this year. Insurrection, as a word, it's gotten more and more controversial as time has gone on, especially with the false flag stuff. But I don't know. Not when I say false flag stuff, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
The weird potential elements of entrapment where there are FBI agents, who knows who they are, but apparent FBI agents, people who seem like they might be with the FBI, basically, because when Merrick Garland is asked about, okay, do you have FBI agents on the ground, shown footage of this one guy the night before.
His answer is weird.
His answer was like a non-answer. He's saying that he can't answer because it's subject to an ongoing investigation. But again, as I brought up at the time, Attorney General Merrick Garland, effectively one of the top legal authorities in the country, if he wanted to do it, I don't know if he wanted to come out with the info about, okay, we did or we didn't have FBI troops, who's going to chastise him and who's going to go after him?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. It would be weird in this political climate. I'll put it like this. If Merrick Garland says, yes, we had troops on the ground, says nothing more than that, but yes, there were FBI people there, whatever, confirming suspicions, or denies it, and then other people in the administration decide to hound him and go after him, then what universe does that make sense?
Yeah, but who hounds him?
Exactly.
I don't know who hounds him for that. Right. Not to mention, do you really want to give this impression that your agents potentially had something going on the ground? It looks like between giving an impression of, okay, I'm not going to answer this, and I'm not going to say why this guy hasn't been arrested despite all of this video. It seems that between those two things, you would just be more inclined to try to kill this as opposed to kind of letting it go. I mean, and it just, his response is very weird. For all of the people basically saying this is a false flag, and then for him to get asked directly, do you have agents on the ground? Did those agents breach the premises of the building? Did you guys push for XYZ? Why hasn't this particular guy got arrested despite the fact that this particular guy was guilty of sin?
That's the particular thing, is that there was a guy on video who was on the list due to be arrested.
Go to jail today.
And then, exactly.
That guy.
Like threatening, trying to get people to raid the Capitol, the kind of thing that, like, very clearly at the top of the list of the kind of people you should be charging or pursuing in this case. And he gets dropped off the list inexplicably, and they never explain why.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It's very weird stuff.
Carrying on, in international news, President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping will meet in a virtual summit this evening amid rising economic and military tensions between our two countries. Administration officials said the virtual meeting was meant to reassure both sides that misunderstandings and miscommunications would not lead to unintended clashes. Former ambassador to the UN and former governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson, said the American diplomat Danny Fenster had been released from custody by Myanmar and would be traveling back to the United States by way of Qatar. This comes after Fenster, who founded the magazine Frontier Myanmar, was convicted Friday of spreading false or inflammatory misinformation. Inflammatory information, quote unquote. They would call it misinformation. Anyway, they have released him. I want to come back to that for a second. In business news, or really, pardon me, in holidays news, today is America Recycles Day, Clean Out Your Refrigerator Day, Govardhan Puja, I'll come back to that, I Love to Write Day, and National Bunt Day, like bunt cakes or bunt pans.
Oh, I thought you were, okay.
Not blunt.
Not blunt, okay.
Or,
I thought you were like the ball.
Oh, no, or not bunting. No, it's the bunt spelled with the D towards the end of it. Anyway, with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Govardhan Puja, by the way, November 15th this year, the fourth day of Diwali, observed on the fourth day of Diwali. The term means pile of grain, celebrated in Hindu households to cherish Lord Krishna's victory against Lord Indra by elevating the Govardhan hill. And that is about as far as I'll go in the explanation. The explanation goes a lot longer, but that's probably deeper into the weeds than we need to go with that one. Coming back to Myanmar for just a second, I want to set this up for folks who might not necessarily have been paying attention to Myanmar. Myanmar, the country we were just talking about here, that let this American journalist go, this guy who founded and was running this magazine in Myanmar. Myanmar was the subject of a coup, right? Not all that long ago. I believe it was February 1st, earlier this year, less than a year ago.
Yeah, less than a year.
Where they basically detained people in parliament, a lot of people in parliament. They took Aung San Suu Kyi, effectively the acting leader of Myanmar. They detained her. They held people on charges. This has been an ongoing military coup that other countries surprisingly have decided not to intervene in. Usually, you'd think the United States, big police person around the world, would step in. But in some of these cases, we don't. And maybe in the case of Myanmar, it's due to its centrality to potential trade conflicts down the line, trade and economic conflicts between the United States and China, where Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, of course, is this big, if you look at it on a map, it's to the southwest of China. And China, which has as its trade ports all sort of facing east into the south and north and China Sea or whatever, this is the China Sea, has all of its trade ports along that east coast. China, looking for another line of export, has pursued a relationship with Myanmar through its Belt and Road program as this sort of major import-export hub, reaching southwest, sort of jumping over the whole region formerly known as Indochina or whatever, jumping over to the southwest. So in that sense, it's a vital sort of bridge for trade for China, and therefore China would want to protect that relationship. The United States might want to infringe upon it, but I will note, in the context of American-Chinese relationships, the fact that, as far as I know, neither country is taking some big stand on this one right now is probably a good thing. Yeah. By and large, you see what I'm saying? Otherwise, that could get hot pretty quickly.
Yeah, I would rather stay out of something like that. I mean, and to your point, what does that look like if the United States tries to substantiate itself more in that conflict? Not to mention it being so close to China. And like you said, this kind of trade route stuff, the Belt and Road Initiative being an important objective. And so, yeah, hopefully we stay out of it. Oftentimes, sometimes it's bewildering, the stuff that we'd be willing to get into, despite the fact that we're nowhere near the particular area, don't necessarily have anything invested in it. But it seemed that the world was on this kind of side of, whoa, that's a coup. You guys have basically taken over the government. And it seems that the world basically had a similar perspective on that very specific issue. But who knows if it evolves into something else.
Well, and another side of this, of course, Aung San Suu Kyi, the former leader of this country, the son of sort of the founding military leader of Myanmar, her father, major national figure in the country. Anyway, that's just sort of setting her up. She had been awarded in 1991 the Nobel Peace Prize, basically for her sort of peaceful transition into power. Myanmar had been under military rule for a long time, and through this longer process, and despite being under house arrest for different periods of it, of course, which is part of the thing, the idea is she was this political leader who came out as a strong political and cultural leader during this time of sort of democratic opening up, where the nature of Myanmar state, the Burmese state, shifted. But the thing is, Nobel Peace Prize back in 91, just a couple of years ago, the Rohingya refugee crisis, that was all centered on her.
Yes, it
and
was.
so for American humanitarian interventionists, they might shy away from deciding to step in to protect her.
Because of that very specific issue.
Because of that, even though the
Peace Prize needs to be a little bit more cognizant of who they give an award to, right?
Well,
I mean, they give it to Obama as a way of thumbing their nose at Bush. Obama gets in and makes a speech about just wars, which is astonishing, right? You're having this Nobel Peace Prize, and his argument is like, there are some wars that are basically just.
Wars that are just, and then he becomes the drone king.
Yeah, the drone king. I mean, killing like 90% of those people were civilians that they were killing. I mean, at a certain point, you're not even bombing terrorists. You're just bombing civilians, but every so often you hit a terrorist.
Yep.
Abiy Ahmed, again, I don't blame him for starting the conflict. I mean, this was one of those things where the TPLF launched first. But the same token, you still get a president who basically got a peace prize, ended up in a war again. The Rohingya massacre, where Aung San Suu Kyi was basically as vicious as pretty much any other person in that government on that particular issue.
I get a
All of
feeling
these people got the peace prize.
It's all, well, and in the case of Abiy Ahmed, I know that it's complicated with him personally. I'm going to guess it's complicated with Aung San Suu Kyi. It is kind of complicated in the United States here, but on the other hand, I'm reminded of, wasn't it like Time magazine that had like Hitler on its cover back in the day or something like this? One of those major magazines.
Maybe, I wouldn't be shocked.
It's like
Person of the
Time
Year
or Life or
something.
something. Exactly, that kind of thing. The points I'm bringing that up is sometimes humans are also just objectively bad judges of the political character of a person as they're going through the different stages.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's, somebody who's charismatic and gets people to like him isn't necessarily going to stay all that kind in the long run once they have a strong enough, secure hold on power.
And to be fair, there's no way to know. I mean, maybe you should have had a little bit more inkling before giving that to Obama. But for the other two, I mean, that was if you weren't in Ethiopia, and if you didn't kind of see the rumblings on the ground and everything else, and if you didn't have this thought to yourself of, are these guys going to be able to give up authority? Meaning TPLF. Are they going to walk away and leaving this to their own device? Well, the answer was no. But is there any way for somebody who's looking at the Nobel Peace Prize to know that in advance? No, I don't think so. The Rohingya thing, again, I don't know how you know that stuff in advance.
Well, and part of it is, in the case of both Abiy Ahmed and Aung San Suu Kyi, they were politically coming up in countries with very long-lasting sectarian ethnic issues. And this is the point that I want to focus on for a second. They came up in countries that had to deal with long-lasting ethnic divides where people were killing each other, and there was this ultimate struggle for control over the country along ethnic grounds, where, of course, you had the TPLF in Ethiopia, but you also have the Amhara and a number of other smaller ethnic groups.
Yeah.
Myanmar, who knows how many, dozens and dozens of different ethnic groups with a number of like much stronger ones. My point being, if you look at the long run of what people are looking to celebrate after World War II and after the victory of the Nazis and what the whole post-war era was set up, it's getting over ethnic issues as we try to move into nationalism without those vestiges of like ethno-nationalism. Does that make sense? Because nationalism for a long time, in a lot of different ways, was pursued along sort of ethno-nationalist grounds. We've tried to shift it towards culture. And in my opinion, that's completely admirable. The problem is when you assume that you're doing better than you actually are, when you give people awards for managing to get over the hump, so to speak, on these complicated issues, but it turns out they actually didn't. And in the case of Ethiopia or the case of Myanmar, you see a resurgence of those things. And in both of these cases, that's exactly what we see happening. Yeah. With either the refugee crisis in Myanmar or the TPLF crisis in Ethiopia. Those are sectarian conflicts and sectarian groups. And clearly, like Myanmar's civil war, as anybody we talk to can tell us, for the longest time has been along these ethnic grounds where each group is trying to separate into another state or take control of the main one. You know what I mean? Yeah,
they have all these different factions, so these kind of ethnic factions with their own militaries and stuff like that. It's very interesting conflict. I mean, even this kind of the politics that was taking place with Aung San Suu Kyi and the military, where the military basically had the guns, the weapons, and everything else, but she had this kind of political clout that she tried to expand upon. I mean, that was a fascinating conflict. Like, who wins between political power versus weapons, between the thing. And it seems that she was slowly trying to increase her lot in that government, which is not necessarily wrong, right? Especially if your main thing is a democratic order, that's your power. Your power isn't necessarily based in force. Well, why wouldn't you try to expand your grounds on that front? But at the point where the military started you losing a certain amount of, let's say, influence, well, at that point, it flipped out. It was like, this is too far, not an inch further, et cetera. We haven't spoken about that for a while. We haven't had a conversation about what's going on there for a while. It's almost like it fell out of the news as things took place. But as far as I'm concerned, or as far as I know, nothing has fundamentally changed in regards to the competitive sides that are basically being drawn. This kind of government in exile versus the military that's there.
I think what's changed is that the military, the junta or whatever, has won effectively. I mean, at least during this stage of the diplomatic event as it's unrolling or whatever. But on during this year, the military has stayed in power. It's fallen out of the news cycle around the world, unless some outside country that tries to stage a coup or tries to, support local operatives in the long run. You see what I'm saying? I think it's just sort of settled out and they've won. Yeah. Very interesting case. Yeah. And if they work well with the Chinese government, I don't think the Chinese government's necessarily going to mind.
Well, that's the wild part with China. China doesn't necessarily seem to get all that involved into the domestic politics of various countries. It's like, all right, look, we just want peace. Peace is good for business. We will, whatever that means.
We just want business.
We just want business.
And peace is good for business.
Yeah, peace is good for business. It's not like this thing where the U.S. is like, yeah, we don't like that guy. You need to remove that guy for us to have any kind of dealings with you. It's like, yeah, but the guy was democratically elected. Hey, man, just telling you, you need to move that guy. Like, they don't seem to do that. They seem to be far less involved in this kind of browbeating and directing the country to do X or Y. And look, even from the standpoint of women relationships, like the way that, like Bolivia, for example, was it Bolivia? Yeah, Bolivia, where they had all of this lithium supplies. They were going to make a deal under EVO to work with China because China was basically going to show them how to produce that stuff on the home front. They're going to increase their level of technology, et cetera.
Whereas when you say produce that stuff, you mean I think like battery production?
Yeah, battery production. Yeah, like the lithium batteries and stuff like that for like Elon Musk and whatnot.
Yeah.
And they were going to go with China for that. China was going to give them a better deal, whereas the U.S. is more so, how can we maximize our profit? We don't necessarily want to give you our information, et cetera. It just seems to be a different, let's say, point of view in the way that the countries engage with weaker countries. And I'm not necessarily saying that's great all the way around. I mean, you may come away with some things where China has its own vagaries, but in the very specific interests of business and stuff, they seem to be less hardcore in trying to direct the events of particular countries that they're working with, more in line with this notion of, look, man, we just want peace.
It's true, although on the ideological end, it's not like we're at all consistent in which countries we back versus which countries we choose to ally with, and anything other than strategic expediency. In other words, we'll ally with Saudi Arabia at the end of the day, even though they behead people.
Agreed.
Just because it's in our best interest and big oil producer, and we have a sort of longstanding relationship, and they buy a lot of our armaments, and on and on. We'll do that. It doesn't matter. The inconsistency, I don't know what it is exactly, because I bet that there are true believers in the State Department and the CIA who do believe, okay, that, it matters who we support. No, we got to hold our tongue or whatever and support some of these guys and not really speak up too much about it. But I bet they care. But it's like these outdated, outmoded vestiges of the Cold War mindset. If I take the good faith take seriously, and it's nothing other than just realpolitik with a veneer of rhetoric, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Then it's outdated, outmoded institutions operating on a Cold War mindset that's completely out of place. We've both gone more capitalist and more socialist, and with that controversial take, I think I'll close this out. But in other words, if we're fighting communism abroad or whatever, we've both at the same time gotten more communist at home, I would argue, and more capitalist, and in the sense that our government has grown more, it's gotten more sclerotic, and the corporations have taken more power in the United States, and companies have effectively more power over Americans than they ever did. But that's something we could argue over, so I'll take us into a break if you're okay with that. Because I know you'll quibble and you'll be like, no, he didn't exactly. But
I don't know. I think American foreign policy is very straightforward. I think it's just what's in America's interest, and Americans' interest from the standpoint of corporations or political leaders. If you, for example, think of the Tillerson memo. When Trump first gets in office, Tillerson is written a memo or given to Tillerson that basically says, look, humanitarian grounds is not the way we function. We function entirely for what is in America's best interest. If you have allies who, let's say, are doing some horrible things, you can't necessarily hit those guys. You hit the people based upon who's against us politically. And so they would bring up human rights against China. They would bring it against Iran. By the same token, allies, they basically shut up over. So Saudi Arabia gets a pass. I mean, even TPLF, great example, where you would have the United States who had security associations with him. Well, look at what's happening now. I mean, the Ethiopian government wins in a democratic election, give or take. And the response for Western media is to basically act as if the Ethiopian government is committing genocide. Just weird stuff. Even though they didn't take that perspective when the TPLF was in power. It's just very odd stuff. It seems that our perspective tends to be who's in our best interest. And if this guy is in our best interest in any particular kind of way, be it financial or be it some kind of political interest or security interest, we're not going to bug him. However, if you're not in our best interest, then yeah, we're going to complain about you. So a speech that would be towards Iran would entirely 100% fit towards Saudi Arabia. And yet, we're friends with one. We're not friends with the other.
Here's what comes to my mind, though. And we could go into a break. You want to go to your monologue?
Yeah, sure. But finish your point.
Well, what comes to mind is, say we were to for a second just do a memory wipe and say everybody around the world forgot who America was and America forgot who everybody else was. And with we're aliens who suddenly a culture's the same. I don't know. It doesn't make sense, but go with me for a second. My point is, in this thought experiment, who would we choose to ally with? What would our relationships be? If we had no pre-existing relationships, what would that look like? Because on the one hand, in the next 30 to 50 years, if we're going through a whole epochal shifting period where America loses power and China gains power and the strategic blocks that have defined the world break up, then we're going to have to go through this thought process in some sense anyway. Who are our actual allies? Who are our natural allies? How do we want to make this work, right? That's on the one hand. We're going to have to go through this anyway. But on the other hand, we probably should do something like that because think about the institutions. If they've seen Russia as our principal enemy for the lives of everybody who's been in this thing. Yeah. Growing up, Cold War mindset, you go a couple generations back and everybody views Russia as the big bad guy and the distant memories of the Germans in the past or whatever. You get my point. Now it's China's on the scene. If you get rid of all of those memories, and I'm not saying lose all that wisdom, I'm saying just forget all of those biases, who do you naturally just choose to side with and what actions do you choose to take? What I'm saying is our institutions have an ingrained memory that is biased and irrational, and we would do well to unlearn the biases and get more rational. Yeah. That's where I'd go with it.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. A bunch of geopolitical hawks disagree with it, but I think I agree with it. Let's do this. Let's go in for a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us. From mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind. Color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the D.C. area, or for that matter, found yourself in the D.C. area, you can always catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, of course. You can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I I believe it was a day or so ago, looking through the media and looking through the news, there's this question of how low can Biden polling and support actually go. I swear, it seems like each week that number gets lower and lower and lower without any particular capacity of the president to basically do anything about it. Part of this is kind of like there was a contest between Romney and Obama. And in the contest between Romney and Obama, Obama took a huge amount of time in the very beginning to basically cement this point of view of Mitt Romney. Now, this is somewhat risky politically, right? You're using a huge amount of your resources. You don't necessarily know if the resources are going to continue to come in. And you're basically trying to set the context of a person. So anything that person says, any event that happens to that person, basically comes out of that lens. Meaning, whatever the truth of it is, the point of view of the public in the majority is already set. Whatever foibles come out of it is going to go through that lens. Whatever mistakes are going to go through that particular lens. In Romney's case, this guy is a rich elitist who's basically tone deaf and out of touch with the feelings and the prevalence of the American public. And if you notice, one event after the next, Romney could not shake that point of view. When he was making a comment about half of the public are moochers or something to that effect, again, it falls right directly into that point of view. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because I'm trying to make this point about how a point of view can get set, almost seemingly set in stone, despite its fact that it's somewhat of a cognitive point of view. And anything that the people do after the fact, they have a hard time dislodging that. Meaning the moment that you get in your head, this is true. Whether it's true or not is secondary, but you believe this is true. Anything that happens, all the events that happen after the fact, all the successes, all the negatives, etc., go through that very specific lens that has been created for that particular individual. And in Biden's case, yes, he has another year to go, but I guess I'm going to make this prediction that that year is not even going to really matter, that the perspective of Biden has already been set. And it is unclear to me what Biden could do to extricate himself from that. Some of this has to do with just bad policy. Some of this has to do with bad luck. Some of this has to do with Biden just not being altogether there, seemingly. And you can even make a case that some of this has to do with the people who voted for Biden was basically trying to find somebody that was not Donald Trump. And the moment that Biden is a factor unto himself, running the country for himself, people get this kind of sense of this guy doesn't seem to be altogether there. All of those marbles don't necessarily make a full marble deck. And each problem. So you get the situation of COVID not being resolved and the numbers start to spike. You get this issue of AUKUS and what takes place from a foreign policy standpoint. You get the things of political posturing and things that he said he was going to do that he didn't necessarily do or accomplish. You get his own political party that despite having Congress and the presidency have an inability to get pretty much anything of substance done, despite the fact COVID has just knocked off 700,000 people. And you would think in a situation like that that you're coming into, you as president will be making the there's nothing to fear but fear itself type speeches. It's not what we got. We got somebody who is basically ineffective and with a vice president that was even more ineffective than an ineffective president. And the catch is, how does Biden unravel that particular point of view as he moves forward? And looking at the polling on it, it only seems to continuously get worse in spite of him passing this bill. And I would even make the point, even if he passes the reconciliation bill at some point, you're still stuck with the perspective that was created over the course of the first term. That will lead into the midterms. And at the point where the Democrats lose either the House, the Senate, or both, his presidency is effectively over. And we haven't even dealt with the debt ceiling yet. And how is the Biden administration going to deal with the debt ceiling without the country basically hitting the bricks? People can say, hey, man, I can't believe we're going to hit this. But in the way that the form or in the way that the conversation is being had around the debt ceiling, they're acting as if Mitch McConnell lost something, despite the fact that this is going into December. And how are you going to get this passed in December without using reconciliation? And none of the Republican Party is going to help you on this. Meaning it's one crisis after the next, and those crises haven't necessarily gone anywhere. The public is left with this sneaking suspicion that it's Biden's fault, or for that matter, the fault of the Democratic Party. The Washington Post comes out with recent polling, and this is very brutal. So it found in the latest poll, right here, 43% Well, let's say if the election was held today, that basically 46% of adults would back the Republican candidate for Congress and 43% would support the Democratic candidate. Among registered voters, this advantage goes from 51% to 41% Democrat. That's a 10-point spread. 70% of the American public basically think the economy is negative. That includes 38% of people who said it's in a poor condition. About half of Americans overall in political independence blame Biden for the inflation. More than 6 in 10 Americans say he has not accomplished much after 10 months in office, including 71% of independents. Think of that number, 71% of independents. In fact, you would think that Biden already has a saturation of Republicans who hate his guts, which is true, which means if the polling is getting worse, it's getting worse among independents and it's getting worse among Democrats. You have 44% basically say they trust Democrats over 41% for Republicans. Overall, 7 in 10 Americans say that public schools should students or public schools should teach a great deal or great amount about history and the way that racism affects. Yet, this is still somewhat polarized. You get 9 to 10 Democrats basically saying it needs to be more in regards to history. 7 to 10 independents say, yes, you also need to teach about racism. 4 in 10 Republicans. Now, this was the culture war issue that was able to get Youngkin over the finish line, not to mention the Ethiopians that Youngkin basically backed Youngkin. Biden's overall approval rating based on this polling is at 41%, with 53% saying they disapprove. Those who say they strongly disapprove of the way he's handled it represents 44% of adults. 44% of the country say that they strongly disapprove of the way Biden has basically ran office. Strong disapproval peaks at 80% among Republicans, 45% of independents, and 48% of suburbanites, which is somewhat of a weird one. 44% of white college graduates. All of these people basically say the president is horrible at his job. Biden's approval rating is down from 50% in June to 44% in September, which again, none of this stuff bespeaks of him doing well. In June, 94% of Democrats approved of the way that Biden was handling this job, compared to 3% that disapproved. Today, 80% approve of Biden did his job. 16% are negative. These numbers are stark, and they seem to only, again, be getting worse. 39% view Biden's rating on the economy as positive. 55% view it as negative. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm just trying to give this flavor of this impression that the American public, including Democrats, are not loving this president. And many of them don't want him to run again. This last number that I'm going to give has to do with the number of people that believe Biden actually got something done. And again, that number is rather appalling. You get the overwhelming majority of the people who say that Biden didn't get anything done. Right here. A great deal done, 8%. 8% of the public says Biden has gotten a great deal done. 27% says he got a good amount done. 18%, not very much. 45%, little to nothing. Nearly 60% of the American public basically said this guy hasn't gotten anything done. This doesn't look good. Shane, what are your thoughts about, man?
Real quick, because we have Peter on the line. With Republicans having all this free time and energy, because basically Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema have been doing the negotiations, as far as I can tell, on behalf of the Republicans on this bill. Yeah. And this bill has been what's dominated most of politics' attention for like 6 months. The Republicans have been freed up to focus on whatever they want to.
Pretty much.
With all that time and energy, I'm very curious to see what happens in the midterms, where they go with it, what they choose to do with it. Because we'll see if they're. My point is, if you think in terms of political capital or whatever, they have so much just laying around that if they don't do something effective with it, that's a real show of incompetence. And we'll see if they do something effective with it. On the au contraire, they're actually doing something with it. But I hope hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully you kind of see what I'm saying there, which is they basically all this space to do this stuff. We'll see what they actually do. Anyway, we can go into our break. Peter Oliver is going to be coming with us when we come back. We're going to be talking about a couple of things. We're going to be talking about the gas situation, energy situation in the EU. Also, more events on the border between Belarus and Poland and Lithuania over the weekend as this migrant refugee crisis rolls through the West, again, continuing to blame not just Lukashenko and Belarus, but also, of course, Putin and Russia for this, interestingly enough. We'll be coming back on that story, correcting some falsehoods on the other side of this break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back with Peter Oliver in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. As Shane mentioned before we close, we have this issue associated with the migrants crossing the border between Belarus and, in this case, Poland. The EU, of course, is involved in this, and it seems that the EU is basically taking Poland's side on this, with pressure being put on Belarus to either stop the migrants or at the very least stop assisting the migrants in getting to the border. Over the weekend, this seems to escalate with Alexander Lukashenko, basically making the point of saying, if you add more sanctions, we will basically cut gas traveling into Europe. Now, Putin said, despite having conversations with Lukashenko, that this wasn't necessarily a threat that initially came up, and that this is somewhat problematic in regards to Europe and Europe's energy security. To have a conversation about what is taking place over there, the latest escalations associated with this particular conflict, we're joined with Peter Oliver. Peter Oliver is a EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, economic news from across the European Union. Peter, what's going on, my man?
Hello. Quite a lot is going on. We are busy in this part of the world at the moment.
It seems, it does seem to be pretty busy over there. What's the latest on this? The last I heard about this, Lukashenko basically threatened to limit gas supplies going into the EU. Considering EU's current dilemma in regards to energy production, that seems like that would be somewhat of a major threat. How does he have control over gas supplies? And, seeing Putin basically saying, him and I never talked about that, that seems to, be somewhat of a, this probably is not necessarily going to happen, or this particular threat doesn't have the legs that he wants to get it across. What's going on with this? Why did he use this as a threat? And why not have this conversation with Putin before even putting this threat out there?
Well, he uses it as a threat because it's one of the only things he has left. Alexander Lukashenko has alienated just about everybody on the international scene. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, pretty much his only person to go to have a conversation with. And after he'd mentioned this, he'd said that I will cut off Europe's gas and we won't allow that gas to flow into the EU. It does seem that he's been reminded that gas isn't Belarusian gas, that that gas comes from Russia, that it merely travels across Belarus's territory, and Belarus has a contract with Russia in which Belarus gets paid quite handsomely to allow that transit to happen. As you said, we've also heard from Vladimir Putin about this. He said that there was absolutely nothing mentioned the last time he'd spoken to, well, he said, that's the first time I've heard it, because I've talked to Alexander Grigorovich twice recently, and he's never told me about it, never even hinted about it. The suggestion from the Kremlin is that this may have been said in the heat of the moment, and once Alexander Lukashenko and the rest of the Belarusian leadership actually realize what it would entail, they're not going to be stopping that gas arriving in Europe. Because as you mentioned earlier on, Jamal, this is crunch time when it comes to gas in the EU. That Yamal pipeline, I beg your pardon, that goes across Belarusian territory into Poland and then into Germany. It's the crucial line at the minute in order to keep the supplies of Russian gas, the contracted supplies, at the levels that they need to be. Also, the small amount and the increases that are being made in supplying more gas that Europe's having to buy on the current market in order to try and meet demand. That market, of course, well, the prices on that market skyrocketing this year because there is such high demand for gas in Europe.
Makes sense. Well, another side of this that I wanted to come to is the idea that Putin or that Russia, for instance, is this is a segue from the migrant crisis, of course, but was using that as a ploy to hurt the West, which has been metamorphosed by the Western press into this idea that Putin and Belarus together, despite Putin's protest and despite the Russian side's protest really against using this as a threat, despite the fact that Russia's coming down on them effectively, I'm seeing admittedly a bit more of a slightly tabloid-leaning newspaper, but in the UK, EU gas crisis mapped, Russia and Belarus plot winter of hell. And then they're saying that the UK can sidestep the choke. That's a smaller outlet, but it was just a couple of days ago and still very recently while this stuff was happening in the New York Times. Again, the New York Times, Washington Post, I'm seeing other outlets, not just associating Belarus with Russia as if they were Russia's lapdog or as if they did whatever Russia wanted them to do, but also trying to make this explicitly an anti-Russia move. Do you see that on the EU? What's your take on that, Peter?
Oh, massively so. But the thing is it doesn't really make sense. When you scratch that argument even slightly, you find that the idea that Russia would want to do one of two things that are constantly in the newspapers at the moment on this side of the Atlantic is that Vladimir Putin is controlling Alexander Lukashenko and the migrant situation with the border with Poland, and Russia's apparently about to invade Ukraine right now. That was a surprising one that came out on Sunday. We had General Sir, I'll remember his name in a second. Anyway, the former leader of the armed forces in the United Kingdom was on TV shows over there saying that we need to beef up our security because we need to be ready for war with Russia. Absolutely no signs of that coming anytime soon. There's a lot of talk about Russian troop movements on the Ukrainian border. The problem is that's in Russia, and they're Russian troops moving in Russia. So ultimately what you have is there's no real idea that Russia would be doing either of these things, particularly when you look at what is at risk, and that is particularly the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. These are probably the most important 3 to 4 months in Nord Stream 2's existence. It's at this point that it will be getting its final rubber stamp to say that 55 billion cubic meters of gas, it's enough for about 3 million homes, can be put into operation, could be put into fully operation. The thing is this is going to make billions of dollars for a lot of people over the next 15 to 20 years. It's there's absolutely no way that would be put at risk for the sake of upsetting Poland and the European Union because of what's going on at these borders. Ultimately, and if you were to ask my opinions on what's going on, this is a perfect power play by two strongmen at the moment between Alexander Lukashenko, who's facing real problems in terms of people questioning his legitimacy. He gets to say, I stood up to those Europeans when they challenged us. Whereas in Poland, the right-wing government there with President Duda and Prime Minister Morawiecki, they get to say, we defend Europe's borders. We defend...
Peter? We might have lost you, Peter. Just giving you a second to come back. Oh,
there it is.
You know
that's the telltale.
You know what I'm going to do, actually? I'm going to take us into a brief break. We've been speaking with Peter Oliver. We've been talking about over the events over the weekend. Basically, Belarus accusation from the West is they've been importing migrants specifically in order to send them over the border into the EU. And specifically, they've been saying Putin directed Lukashenko to do this. That accelerated. The EU broadly has a lot of sanctions on Belarus right now. Belarus said that if they decide to escalate those in response to this, if they move in that direction, then he would shut off gas flow flowing through Belarus to the EU. Russia, meanwhile, just a few days later, said, no, that's not going to happen. This puts the whole thing, it adds a couple layers to it. Anyway, we've been discussing that. We'll get back to another side of the story as well as the general energy crisis in the EU.
When I first heard that, I was like, Belarus, that's Belarus's gas?
Yeah.
I was like, I didn't think that was their gas.
No.
And then later on, it was like, oh, that's not their gas. It's transported through that country.
I don't even know if it's their pipe. It's their land.
It's just the land.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, dude, you don't have control over that.
Anyway, that's going to piss off both neighbors, and that's what they soon found out. We'll be coming back with Peter Oliver on the other side of this short break. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories, all in one place. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We're going to continue the conversation about the issues that are taking place with the escalation on the border, with migrants on the border between Poland and between Belarus. And basically, the European Union is standing beside Poland, despite some of the issues it has with Poland's own foreign policy. Now, to continue the conversation, we're joined with Peter Oliver. He's the EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Peter, welcome back.
Hello. Sorry about that. I think you lost me before. If you let me know where I was when I disappeared, I'll pick up from there.
So I guess the question boiled down to, I'm just asking the question. Is there any truth at all to Putin having some kind of influence in this particular issue? Like, you made the point of saying that they were friends, yes. But just because you're friends with somebody doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking orders or direction from them in the way that some of these media outlets are basically trying to make it seem like it, is. So what is Putin's influence on this, and what effect has he had on this particular, this kerfuffle, as I would call it, but this international incident?
Yeah, well, look, I obviously don't have an insight into the inner workings of the mind of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, but if I did, of course, I'd probably be doing something far more important than what I'm doing right now. But it does not seem highly likely that, or realistic that Russia is trying to manipulate Belarus in this situation in order to create the tensions that we're seeing. It's far more likely that Alexander Lukashenko and the right-wing Polish government of President Duda and Prime Minister Morawiecki have a lot to gain from both being able to say, we're the strong men in this situation. I think I was saying that the Central Bank of Poland has issued a new banknote in which they are commemorating those that defended the eastern border. So this is the narrative that's being spun in Poland. For Russia, there's absolutely nothing to gain from doing this, particularly when you look at what is going on with Nord Stream 2. This is perhaps the most important 3 to 4 months in getting that pipeline, that huge infrastructure project taking Russian gas under the Baltic Sea directly into Germany. It's crucial 3 to 4 months in that getting the go-ahead to be fully operational. Now that, in the long term, 15 to 20 years, is worth untold billions of dollars to Moscow, but also to the companies involved in getting it done. So it doesn't make much sense in trying to antagonize the EU, who will have a part to play in giving that the go ahead. But a lot of these headlines that you'll see both in the US and in the UK and in the EU as well, I mean, they're very similar in a lot of ways to those we saw about the idea that Russia's about to invade Ukraine at the drop of a hat. That, of course, that makes perfect sense to do that in the middle of winter, and with everybody watching. Now, a lot of the commentators who've mentioned this are pointing to the fact that Russian troops are are moving on the border with Ukraine. Well, of course, on the border with Ukraine is Russian territory. So this is essentially Russian troops moving within Russian territory. It is worth pointing out that you've had General Sir Nick Carter. I remembered his name now. He's the former chief of staff in the United Kingdom. Interesting enough, nothing to do with the guy from is it the Backstreet Boys, another Nick Carter? Because his, actually, worth just going completely off topic, his predecessor was called General Sir Mike Jackson, also nothing to do with the other pop star. But he was there saying that the UK needed to up its budgets in order to fend off potential attacks from Russia. I think a lot of these have to do with the fact that it's time for budgets. It's time for things to be agreed, and war with Russia sells, particularly if you look at things. Particularly if you look at a lot of the commentators, most will have something to do with the Atlantic Council. I would imagine a few fellowships there are up for review as the US agenda shifts probably away from Russia and towards China in the near future. Quite a few people trying to make sure that their role that they play is one that will continue. And you do that, of course, by if you're in that game of saying there's going to be war, there's going to be war, there's going to be war, well, you win both ways. If there is a war, you predicted it. If there's no war, well, it's because you flagged it up.
But okay, so part of this narrative, though, part about the whole narrative, I just want to pivot back to Russia. And in the context of Belarus and Poland, in both of their sort of national political strategies, that makes perfect sense. But also, in general, with the EU, part of the gas energy narrative going into winter has been, ooh, Russia, the boogeyman withholding gas. And we've gotten into this conversation before with you about, it's quite a bit more complicated than that. These countries actually need to renew their contracts. Some of them aren't doing that. And some of them, instead of renewing on a contract basis, are now having to pay basically per unit at sort of market prices, which drives those prices up. My point in sort of restating all of that is to say this narrative that Russia is behind this might contribute to the idea, even though in both cases it's off base and unsupported, the idea that, ooh, Russia, the boogeyman, trying to withhold energy from Europe, that kind of thing. Do you see that conversation being had, not just maybe in the media, but also do you think that's a genuine thing that people diplomatically, politically at the higher levels are thinking? And hopefully the narrative makes sense. Please, if I'm getting anything wrong there, correct me. Peter, what do you see?
It makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense in the press, diplomatically and politically at the world leader level. It's exactly the opposite is being said. We've heard already in the last few months from Angela Merkel, German Chancellor. We've heard from Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, that Russia's fulfilling its contracts. There has what it wasn't doing was selling extra gas because it, one, needed to refill its own gas supplies ahead of winter. Two, it could sell that same gas more expensive at a higher price, I beg your pardon, to China, who were willing to pay more and buy more. That also served to drive the price up. But what you are seeing is that actually in the last 24 hours through that Jamarl pipeline that runs through Belarus into Poland, into Germany, you're seeing output of gas, delivery of gas has gone up. Well, you're looking at, it's gone up, I'm looking at the statistics right now, 6.5 million kilowatt hours were sent on Friday alone, just before the weekend there. So you are seeing all of the statistics that just don't go with this narrative. It makes for great copy to be able to say that there is this evil big bad on the east, to the east, who has the control of being able to make everything go cold for us. But ultimately, this comes down to cold hard economics and gas bills. As simple as that. These gas bills that countries have are long-term deals that are set out at a certain price. If you don't have one of those, you pay the market rate. And when the problem with paying the market rate is, of course, is that when things go like they are right now and everybody wants to buy up gas, that gas becomes more expensive. And it's as simple as that, what we've seen.
Peter, what's the worst that can happen in this particular situation? Meaning if it continues to escalate without any kind of abating. I know that the military...
At the border.
Right, is on the border.
Well, the worst is pretty bad, is what can happen. What you have at the moment is you have several thousand emaciated, hungry, thirsty people. It wouldn't break anybody to let those into the European Union. There were protests in Berlin over the weekend with people saying, just let these people in. They can get the care that they need here. We can look after them. Politically, that would cause problems. But when you're talking about worst case scenario, there was an incident in which a Polish soldier died on Saturday evening. That was in an accident that didn't involve anybody else. But as soon as that news came out, that is one of the things people have feared, as it would cause an escalation. What that escalation would be, we just don't know. We also, there is concern that what you have is thousands of reservists, and this isn't to cast any aspersions over the training or the discipline of Polish reserve soldiers. But if you were, say, working in a bank or working in a shoe shop 4 weeks ago, and you're now on the front line and you're armed and you're in the cold and you're working long hours, if something was to go wrong there, that could also send things escalating massively. Ideally, as this situation is reaching what is now pretty much a dire situation humanitarily, you would hope somebody would step in, and the big hope for these people who are on the border is Germany, France will say, okay, Poland, let them through, put them on buses and drive them to Frankfurt Oder. But it is worthwhile pointing out that while I said people were protesting in Berlin saying let them in Frankfurt Oder, which is the town on the border between Poland, one of the main crossings between Poland and Germany, there were protests there saying, don't do that, exactly, don't do that. We don't want these people to come here. We've taken in enough migrants and refugees in our time. So while the escalation is pretty bad, what could happen, I would hope, and I think a lot of people are hoping that once Poland and Belarus have both rattled their sabers as much as they can and as much as they're willing to do, eventually the well-being and the welfare of these people will start to take some form of precedent, and we'll see a better situation. But there's no sign of that happening anytime soon, particularly from the Polish side. Now, it's worthwhile filling you in that my colleagues from RT France, our French language service, they're in Polish custody at the moment. I believe they are anyway. Two lads were, a correspondent and the cameraman. They were trying to film from the Polish side. Poland has put a cordon around their side of the border. They were trying to get in as close as they possibly could. They ended up in handcuffs and have been taken away. They described they managed to get some messages out and described what they call repressive actions by the Polish police, who are acting quite aggressively. As far as I know, David and Jordi are all right. But of course, we are all very concerned in the RT family about what is going to be their well-being, because there is a tinderbox situation on that border, and the fact that the Poles are very keen to make sure that all of the pictures that come out from their side are pictures from the Ministry of Defense, that they are in control of what images come out and what images people see. From the Belarusian side, my other colleague, Igor Judanov, is there as well, in amongst people who are in a dire humanitarian situation. Obviously, one of the worst things that could happen is that more people succumb to hunger, to thirst, and to the conditions that are increasingly getting bad. And we are expecting snow in that area in the next 24 hours.
Peter, great reporting, great factual coverage. As always, we're pretty much out of time, so I think I'll just close it out now. Thank you for joining us. It was really good talking with you this morning, as it always is.
Always my pleasure.
Thank you, Peter. And for those listening, that was Peter Oliver, the EU correspondent for RT International. He provides daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Follow him on Twitter at @PeterGOliver_RT. Also, catch his reporting weekly on RT International. And with that, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. One quick comment on this, Jamarl. Part of the reporting, a bunch of different sides on this. People were saying that in Belarus, national security, like their national security, was giving people wire cutters. Yeah. Some of them were giving people wire cutters, sending them to the border, that kind of thing. For national security establishments to be doing that, it's a little bit over. But I was thinking to myself, if I had wire cutters and these refugees were trying to break in and I was just there, of course I would give them to them. Again, it's a little bit more. But what we get to, I wanted to get into it, but, factually, there's a lot of ground to cover. With these wars, Afghanistan, with NATO intervening in Afghanistan and Iraq, where these refugees are coming, a lot of them, there's this genuine moral guilt, this genuine moral weight that they need to pick up. Anyway, we're closing this out. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Can I come in with just something real quick, Jamarl?
Go for it.
That we were just talking about Kamala Harris and how there's talk that Biden doesn't like Kamala doesn't like Biden. So there's like backfighting on the back end or whatever.
Yeah.
Infighting on the back end. I just wanted to go back and check Dick Cheney, the least likable vice president in living memory.
Right.
I just did a quick search. Yeah. It was in 2007, July 2007. I think this was the lowest his rating ever got.
What was it?
30%. Kamala's at
28.
Yeah, 28 was the last time we checked. So she is already, and I saw people on Twitter like, what has she done? What has she done? And I think I said it.
Nothing.
That's the
problem.
And that's the point.
She's done nothing.
That's exactly the thing. Anyway.
Yeah, this report is amazing. The New York Post comes out with this article. Kamala Harris sidelined amid growing tensions with Biden, insiders say. And, you know, from our point of view watching this, we're like, but she hasn't done anything. That's the issue. Like, even when Biden says, go and handle this issue, she's still the invisible woman. And so it has, I strongly suspect it has more to do with that than anything else. But let's get to the headlines. It's just an interesting story. If you remember, her polling is 10 points less than Biden. And if you listen to the monologue, Biden's polling is at 38 points, depending upon which poll you're looking at, even by the Washington Post standards. He is underwater in regards to the people who basically think he's either not doing anything or getting anything accomplished, incompetent, or, for that matter, just popularity. Many people not even wanting him to run again. In fact, you have more people that wanted Biden to not run again in compared to Trump. Very horrible polling. And, however bad it is for Biden, it's even worse for Harris. But let's get to the headlines. We can bring that up at some other point. In the news, yesterday in the United States, there were 25,411 new COVID cases reported, along with 464 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 80,885 cases per day, an increase of 11% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 68% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 47,036,751 people across the United States and has killed 761,908 human beings in America. By the way, keep in mind, the 464 number and the 25,411 number, those numbers are always extremely low on Monday. They tend to pop back up by the time you get to Tuesday and Wednesday. I think it's a reporting issue. There's no way to know for certain, but those numbers are typically not accurate on Monday. In national news, 500 National Guard troops have been set on standby as attorneys in the Kyle Rittenhouse case prepare to make their closing arguments today. The troops are stationed outside of Kenosha, Wisconsin, ahead of a possible verdict. Closing arguments will be given for up to 5 hours a day, and the jury of 8 men and 10 women will be narrowed to 12 by a drawing of names. In more case law news, a federal grand jury has returned an indictment against former President Donald Trump's advisor, Steve Bannon, for contempt of Congress over his defiance of a subpoena from the Select Committee investigating the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol. The indictment sets off what will likely be a contentious legal battle with significant ramifications for January 6th committee as it seeks to compel other witnesses to testify about the events leading up to the attempted insurrection. In international news, President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping will meet in a virtual summit on Monday evening amid rising economic and military tensions. Administration officials said the virtual meeting was meant to reassure both sides that misunderstandings and miscommunications will not lead to unintended clashes. Former ambassador to the United Nations and former governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson, said the American diplomat Danny Fenster has been released from custody of Myanmar and will be traveling back to the United States by way of Qatar. This comes after Fenster, who founded the magazine Frontier Myanmar, was convicted Friday of spreading false or inflammatory information. Heavy rains and thunderstorms in the Egyptian city of Aswan has left 3 people dead and 500 injured. The storm forced scorpions from their hiding places into many houses across the province, and at least 503 people were hospitalized after suffering scorpion stings. Wow. All patients were discharged after receiving anti-venom doses. You have another interesting story that's taking place right now. Ghislaine Maxwell, her trial is basically starting. So arrest right here. When jury selection starts in earnest on Tuesday for British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell's sex trafficking trial in Manhattan Federal Court, many observers think that they would finally learn the truth about the crimes of her consort, disgraced financier, Jeffrey Epstein. This is, of course, the person who basically supposedly killed himself, apex pedophile, Ghislaine Maxwell was connected to. And so the question becomes, what does she know? And in the same way that people wanted to get various information out of Jeffrey Epstein before he either offed himself or, for that matter, somebody helped off him, they're hoping that it goes to her now. What does she know? When does she know it? Who else is involved? Even though this case has basically died down from the radar after Epstein died, if Epstein had all of these other connections, well, those connections haven't gone anywhere now that he's passed. And I think the next question boils down to, how was Ghislaine Maxwell involved in this? And who was Jeffrey Epstein connected to? In holiday news, we have Natural Philanthropy Day, National Raisin Bran Cereal Day. How did it get its own holiday? And Odd Socks Day. Odd Socks Day. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So I wanted to go to this particular article in the New York Post. Kamala Harris sidelined amid growing tensions with Biden, insiders say. And look, I don't know if you guys have been paying attention, but Kamala Harris has basically been invisible. Now, that's not Biden's fault. In fact, Biden would give her certain things to deal with. For example, the immigration issue. And she, to her credit, she was like, I just want to be in Europe. I mean, I've never been to Europe either. It's like, why are you telling us about Europe? He gave you the border to deal with. You had all of these migrants and whatnot at the border. You had all of these horrible conditions. And the president was giving you something to deal with. Now, I get that it's not the sexiest of issues to deal with. By the same token, the president basically gave you a responsibility. And if you were able to handle it, knock it out the park, somehow show a certain degree of leadership in the way that you're trying to handle that particular issue, well, when your time comes around, you could say, this is what I've done. I worked with the president on this issue. I worked with the president on that issue. I helped Biden do whatever. That's what you get to do as vice president. That's what Biden did with Obama, right? If you think about Biden's speeches when he's talking about what he was doing during the administration, well, Biden made it look like him and Obama were basically co-presidenting, even though we know that wasn't necessarily true, but it didn't matter per se. Biden, at the very least, anything that Obama gave him, Biden ran with. I didn't have this impression in my head that Biden was basically pushing back against Obama and the various policies that he pushed forth. Whatever Obama told him to do, he basically did. I don't necessarily get that sense from Kamala Harris. And in fact, I've often called her the invisible woman or the first affirmative action vice president, because it doesn't necessarily seem like she's very good at her job. Now, Kamala Harris and her acolytes, people who basically supported her during the primaries and everything else, may look at this and try to blame Biden for this. But if you remember, Kamala Harris wasn't that popular even during the primaries. And from the standpoint of the African-American votes and everything else, they didn't go to her. They were basically going to either Biden or Sanders, with a smattering going to Kamala Harris. They made the point right here. It says her defenders told CNN that they were passing around an Onion story. White House urges Kamala Harris to sit at computer all day, just in case an email comes through, pointing to this notion that, what is she doing? What is she doing in that office? Nobody knows. It says right here, she's becoming more frustrated at the lack of the support that she gets from the White House during her numerous PR nightmares, insiders say. And they're trying to show a comparison with Pete Buttigieg, who basically took all that time off. I think he took 2 months off after they had a kid, basically saying, well, they jumped to his defense, this white male, but they didn't jump to her defense, this colored woman or this woman of color. I mean, come on. Let's not bring race into this immediately, because I don't necessarily think this issue has anything to do with race. I mean, keep in mind, Kamala Harris was basically put into that role because she was a woman of color. Let's be honest. And on top of that, from the standpoint of her being in this kind of high-profile position, she has basically seemed to be utterly and entirely invisible. It's not really a factor of race. That's more so a factor of her, and a factor of her just being completely unlikable. So we'll see. We'll cover the story as it goes on, but it did seem as if these two were not necessarily getting along. And like I said, it's very rare where you see these two together, let alone see Kamala Harris at all. And I would point out that her problems probably more along the lines of that, not necessarily any kind of issue with the president is undermining her. But I don't know. We can have a conversation about it. One last thing before we close on the Epstein thing. Look, whether Epstein killed himself or not, I don't know anybody who thought Epstein was ever going to make it to trial, which says something. When Epstein first got caught, there was all of these allegations and there was all of this thought about how did this guy get into the position that he got into? How did he meet all of these people that were in intelligence and politics, in entertainment, etc.? I mean, the works. And then when you find out he had basically a pedophile Allen, he was an apex pedophile in regard to the way that he was going after and getting these young girls to be involved in this conflict or this issue that he was going with. Well, the catch becomes, was anybody else involved? Meaning those celebrities, those politicians, those media types, did they know what was taking place because they were in some way partaking of what was taking place? And whether they knew or not, on some level, there was going to be some level of an investigation to figure out what did they know? Were they involved? Who else was involved beyond Epstein on this particular issue? Who was on those flights? Who did go to that particular island? Who did get those quote-unquote massages from the various young ladies that was basically being pulled into this particular process? And when Epstein died, it seems like that stuff just went up in smoke. It's like, oh, nothing to see here, folks. And I would imagine there were a lot of people who were out there chest thumping the fact that Epstein died. I was one of those people that actually wanted Epstein to talk. I thought him talking was far more important than him dropping dead. In the case with Ghislaine Maxwell, well, she's still alive. And the catch becomes, is she going to talk? And if she does, what is she going to say? And that's one of the most interesting things in the world to me about this case. What are your thoughts, Shane? I mean, we only have about 2 or 3 minutes left, but Ghislaine Maxwell trial is basically starting on Tuesday. They're going to start getting the jurors at this point. And, you know, we've been waiting on this for months at this point. It's what, 4 or 5 months, if not a little bit longer, that we've been waiting on this particular trial. We've had Prince Andrew embarrass himself, basically lying fabulously. And for whatever reason, I don't know why he thought that was going to be a good idea to do that interview, but he did that interview and looked horribly in it. Maxwell has put for herself to be let out, saying that she's done nothing wrong, or in other cases saying that letting Epstein off the other time fit her in it, meaning, you know, their ability leading, I believe it was Acosta, letting him off in whatever the deal they made arrange in order to let him off on that particular crime, that she was under that particular provision. None of that stuff worked. She's not going anywhere. Is she going to talk?
I don't know. Super fascinating. That's what everybody's waiting for. She's done some weird stuff, and it's almost like she's weirdly nonchalant about it. Again, more than a year now, 15 months at this point, that she's been behind bars in various conditions, I hear. But just the other day, when she saw her sister, also a socialite, you know, she's in the courtroom. Yeah. They're letting her out. She like blows a kiss at her sister, which just comes across weirdly. You know what I mean? It comes across kind of weirdly. If you take this person as the madame for Epstein, the procurer of dozens of underage women who would, by any account, really, as far as I can tell, could be raped, a lot of them, put into positions where they're extorted, and you know, underage. I don't know how to say it so many other times. That's this woman. That's the person who's widely believed, at least, to be doing that stuff. So for her to be so, it almost comes across as flippant. You know what I mean by nonchalant about it? Yeah. With that one move, it's a weird thing. On the other hand, if she's innocent and she's just saying hi to her sister, it's nothing. Yeah. So I can kind of see it from both sides. But by all
basically the lens that you take on her.
But I'll put it like this: I don't know how you could be so close to Epstein, hearing everything that we have about Epstein and about how continuously he did this stuff, without knowing. And I'd need to go back through the case, but it seems like she was in a pretty central position.
Procuring women.
Yeah. As others have alleged that she's
young
done.
Girls. Procuring young girls.
Well, yeah. Thank you, young girls. Thank you very much for that correction. Procuring young girls. which they've alleged that, you know, she brought them in, basically, that she was the one who went out. Why would they allege that?
Yeah.
Do they have something out for her with Epstein? No, it's because she would be doing that. So again, it comes across as flippant, nonchalant, and therefore like she's some sort of sociopath or something, which is sad.
Yeah.
But
I can't believe they let either one of two things. Either they let Epstein kill himself or let somebody else off Epstein.
But then there's the other side of this, which is the national intelligence establishment potential complicity in creating a blackmail scheme based on pedophilia.
That part too.
That's
why it was part of the reason it was important to keep him alive.
Yes.
I mean, I've heard there was reporting that he thought that he may be able to leverage one for either freedom or time off, that type of stuff. I don't know. I would say this, though. I knew of nobody that thought he was going to make it to trial. I knew of nobody. And at the point where he ended up dead, they were like, yep, that's what we expected.
Yeah.
Just the connections that he had, people were thinking to themselves, what does this guy know? Like, who's this guy connected to? And like I said, when he died, it was just weird and eerie that basically all of the investigations and the tethers kind of like went along with it.
They faded away.
Yeah, they just faded away.
She's the last link, and we haven't really heard from her at all, other than little bits here and there. So we'll see what actually comes out. The thing is, if we take this seriously, and if we take, okay, Epstein didn't kill himself, somebody killed him, the establishment had it out for him because there are plenty of people in the establishment who have blackmail on them. I'm just spelling the, trying to very clearly say what a lot of people, I'm sure, are reading between the lines on this case. Then what are we going to get from this? Say the establishment had it out for Epstein. They're going to have it out for Ghislaine Maxwell, too. They might not want to kill her, but they're certainly going to do everything they can to allow her to keep her silence.
Yeah.
And maybe put her behind bars based on that, but keep it limited to this little narrow circle of people involved to it, if they decide to pursue it. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, not to mention, she saw what happened to Epstein. That too. Meaning, like, if you believe that he didn't kill himself,
yes,
or if you believe that because of the things that he knew, this is what took place, you may be more inclined to shut up yourself.
Exactly. Just those last two words were shut up. Basically,
shut up, right.
Literal. That is what they want her to do. Anyway, we can go into our break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back talking about China and the U.S. Their summit today on the other side of this break. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the D.C. area or find yourself in the D.C. area, you can always catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Well, we're trying to get our guests on the line, but we're going to have a conversation with Carl Jha about the Biden-Xi Jinping summit. Now, Biden is the one who basically called for the summit, and the goal being to ensure that there's, let's say, competition, or deep competition, as Biden calls it, doesn't necessarily end up into accidental conflict. They have several points that they're apparently supposed to discuss as areas of disagreement between China and the United States, including China's human rights abuses, quote unquote, America's commitment to defending Taiwan, China's support of its state-based industries and its policies regarding cyber technologies. There's also expected to be a conversation, and again, this is on anonymity of the source. The person wasn't necessarily given permission to basically explain what's taking place, but did so on condition of anonymity. Areas where China and the U.S. are in also alignment. So this includes efforts to combat global warming, for example. So we're going to have a conversation with Carl Jha about it. It is unclear whether certain issues like U.S. tariffs or, for that matter, the deal to provide nuclear submarines to Australia, another sticking point, especially from the standpoint of China, if this is going to be on the marquee for discussion. Let's see. Is Carl here yet? Carl, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, so we're still trying to get him on.
Still trying to bring him on.
Yeah.
This interesting balance, because on the one hand, I see some people trying to say, okay, the U.S. is trying to be even-handed with this. It's trying to be soft. On the other hand, I see articles saying that Biden is planning on getting tough on him.
Yeah.
And I can't tell which mode we're in. And it seems like inevitably the messaging here is trying to placate multiple parties at once.
Yeah.
We're going to be tough on him, but we're going to be even-handed and balanced. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. It comes across to me almost like the Putin-Biden summit, where, media had this thing like Biden is going to give him the goods, when he gets into the room. And Biden comes out and he basically tries to placate both. He comes out and says, well, I told him this and I told him that. And then later on, it's like, so we're going to be trying to work together, et cetera. And it was like, what do you mean you're going to be trying to work together? Like the media just got all annoyed by the whole prospect of Biden trying to be conciliatory in any particular way. But this one, this is somewhat of a big deal. From the standpoint of the tensions, if a conversation with Russia was necessary because of the hysteria between the U.S., the Ukraine, Russia, et cetera, then this also feels legitimate and necessary to me. The U.S. has basically said they will militarily defend Taiwan. Australia basically came out recently saying they would militarily defend Taiwan also. And, the strategic ambiguity around the whole policy of Taiwan and its independence seems to be going out the window, which seems to be leading to much larger potential for conflict. Personally, I appreciate these meetings. I think these meetings are typically good, meaning I would prefer people talk as opposed to just basically get into their own enclaves and just, throw spears across to one another. But what comes out of it, that's the part that's more, I don't necessarily quite get. Maybe it's communications just for the sake of communication. But I kind of feel like the one with Russia, where it didn't feel like anything tangible was accomplished outside of just being able to open up communication in and of itself, which I guess is tangible in some way, but not necessarily in a way that changes things. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think anything comes out of this of substance outside of just, okay, the communication sides? The communication is open between the two sides.
I don't think that it will be productive in the sense that I don't think this meeting will be directly beneficial for our relationship with China.
Yeah.
Probably what's going to happen is we're going to go into it. Biden's going to go into it. Xi Jinping will do what the Chinese have been doing recently, which is effectively treating the U.S. like a peer and treating us a little bit derogatorily because we keep treating them like they're subservient to us. So there'll be the general tone from the Chinese has been sort of mocking.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Much,
for good reason. I'm not going to try to hit them too hard, even though ultimately I'm on America's side on this stuff. But we've been bungling this. So anyway, we'll go into that. Xi Jinping will treat us like a peer. We will take that as a provocation, and we will come back to the American press with that. And or it'll be, Biden will try to paint it as productive, but I don't know what progress will actually be had. And I'm sure that whatever will come out of the meeting, the little bits that will come out of it, I'm pretty sure there will be enough for the State Department hawks to be like, ooh, China's coming after us or coming for us. They said this thing and Biden didn't stand up strongly enough, that kind of thing. I could see that messaging. We'll see. You're asking me a hard question, which is what's going to happen. And that's a traditionally hard question to ask.
It's hard to know.
I could be wrong, but I see that kind of thing happening.
It's funny. I often wonder when they actually get into these meetings, do they meaning from the standpoint of China, like you said, the U.S. is a peer. We're in no condition either morally or otherwise to basically dictate terms. But does Biden know that when he's in the room? Like when he's having the conversation with Putin and these guys are sitting across from one another, does Biden realize, okay, we're both leaders of this particular country. I can't necessarily treat him as if he's subordinate to me in a particular way because nothing is going to come out of this if I take that tact. And regardless of what you relate to the media, because you may play that role for the media, do you really play that role when you're sitting across from the person having the conversation? I get the feeling you may not. And so
I can guess at that question, but that's the $64 million question in some sense. What do these people actually think of each other? And if push comes to shove, Because what Biden thinks of Xi Jinping is not just what Biden thinks of Xi Jinping. It's what he was primed to think of him by years and decades of experience in Congress and, in the circles that he's in.
1,000% true.
What is that group actually, what are their feelings? What are their gut level feelings? If you could think of a culture, if you could think of this community as a culture, and that culture is having its own kind of psychology, and different people are going to have different variants of it. What is that psychology? What is that mind, that culture's mind, think of Xi Jinping, and how's that going to change? Because how we feel about him right now is not how we felt about him 10 years ago, 5 years ago. How we feel about China is not how we felt about them 30 years ago, very clearly.
Yeah.
And it's probably going to change over the next couple of years. So if, in other words, you asking me that question, if I had the answer to that one, I'd be in a real good spot, fly on the wall of the mind of Joe Biden, understanding what's going to happen in the world right now.
Yeah.
But another point that I feel should be made about this, that you're talking about strategic ambiguity and how maybe there's less of it, but in a bad way, potentially, because we have vowed to defend China militarily. That could blow away with the breeze the next election if Trump comes in or some other candidate comes in. The thing with strategic ambiguity and those kinds of things is any new American president, especially when they're coming in as a non-incumbent, of course, when they're running against somebody else, they're naturally an unknown quantity when it comes to foreign policy, despite a lot of what they've said. People can change their tune. World leaders know somebody comes in and suddenly they change a bit. You know what I mean? And so whatever commitments we make or whatever sense China gets of our attitudes right now could change in a couple of years very easily.
Yeah.
And sooner if, sadly, Biden passes, which is a possibility as old as he is, and Kamala takes charge or whatever happens there. Probably Kamala, of course.
This becomes a wild card. I mean, when Trump came in, he made that call to Taiwan. People's head exploded. Like, what is he doing? The president is not supposed to be doing this. But Biden hasn't necessarily backed away from it at all. I mean, he's basically stuck with the same tact of they're committing genocide. We're going to defend Taiwan militarily, et cetera.
Same old deal.
Yeah, he just kept the same tact. I do think, though, that when they're in conversation with one another, there is no way he's acting in the way that he acts in front of media. I just don't buy that. Like, I don't think anything happens in a meeting where you sit and look across at your counterpart, and your first perspective is, okay, I'm going to treat you as if I am somehow higher and better and ethical and moral than you are in this meeting. Biden, they just killed a bunch of kids in a bombing strike, in a drone strike. And then the U.S. basically gave itself a pass on it. The Pentagon says, we forgive ourselves.
Seven children, I think it was, you're talking about in this one crash.
Yeah, the moral authority thing is not there. That's my point.
There's 7 underage folks.
7 kids, yeah. And so regardless of what Biden may say to the press, I would imagine when these guys are there one-on-one, it's a different conversation if there's any chance of getting anything accomplished. But I don't know.
I guess my point with the 7 kids, I want to go back and look at the dates just because some of them are probably teens. I need to go back and look at it. And therefore, it doesn't make you a non-kid, but 7 non-adults is my point with that. No, I hear you completely on this one. Are you down to go into a break and come back and take calls? And if we want to, we can hit the Kyle Rittenhouse trial real quick. Testimony.
Absolutely.
Obviously, late last week from that, Kyle Rittenhouse's testimony. We only talked about it briefly on Friday.
Yeah, we were trying to get somebody in that talk about the legality.
And we wanted to get somebody in, but it's been a little bit hard finding people. But, obviously an interesting case. 500 National Guard troops getting sent down. I don't think anything's going to happen if he gets acquitted, but we'll see what happens. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Hi, I'm political analyst Garland Nixon.
And I'm political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist Dr. Wilmer Leon.
We're the co-hosts for The Critical Hour, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C.
We close out your day with a thorough and hard-hitting analysis of the day's top stories, where we bring in brilliant scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time, when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show,
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. 202-521-1320. That's the phone number. Again, 202-521-1320. 1320. We are talking about the trial of Kyle Rittenhouse. After last week, Kyle Rittenhouse himself gave testimony. Now, this was the then 17-year-old, now 18-year-old, currently on trial, who last year in late August, during the Black Lives Matter protests, went to a protest taking place in Kenosha, Wisconsin, brought an AR-15 with him, and I'm giving just the bits that were known at the time, brought his AR-15 with him, and by the end of the night, the morning, what came out was he had shot 3 people, killing 2 of them. And naturally, this was during the heyday of the Black Lives Matter protests, when at that time in other parts of the country, literal cities had been occupied. Parts of cities, multi-block sections of cities had been occupied. There was all this back and forth between Antifa and Proud Boys, literal fighting in the streets. People were wondering, wow, this looks really bad. What is this? What is this going to escalate into? And then Kyle Rittenhouse shot 3 people, killing 2 of them. And people were like, wow, this is a serious escalation. Now, that was last year. Clearly more has come out since then. Mm-hmm. This is the trial. This is where a lot of stuff comes out. And I think a lot of people who didn't know all that much about the specifics of the case, if they heard about the testimony of Kyle, if they've even been watching it more or less peripherally, at least if they've been paying attention to it, they've probably been learning things. So for instance, back then, I did not know that Kyle Rittenhouse's family, like it seems like half his family practically lived in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Kyle, got to remember, doesn't live in Wisconsin. He lived across state lines in Illinois, about a dozen miles away. And so in order to get there, he had to drive across state lines. People have been making, of course, a big point of that. I didn't realize at the time, he brought this up during the trial, it came out. His dad, his grandmother, and his aunt and uncle all live in Kenosha. And if you look at it on a map, Kenosha is a sort of, to the north of Chicago, it's the kind of large city in the region. And where he is, southwest of there, I'm forgetting the name of the smaller town, but they call it west by southwest of there, about a dozen miles away. It's slightly closer to Kenosha than it is to Chicago. A decent amount. It's maybe a 15-minute drive over to Kenosha, mm-hmm. compared to, call it a half an hour, 40-minute drive to Chicago. So Kenosha is sort of his, neighborhood. I think that's, in my opinion, that's more or less taken at this point. Now, what he says he was doing, this is backed up by witness testimony, but this is his whole narrative and the defense's narrative. He was going out there the night of to provide medical assistance, to provide medical aid, and to put out fires. He also brought with him the day of body armor, which he didn't end up wearing. He gave to a friend of his, and an AR-15 rifle, which he'd only used like once. He barely used it, hadn't ever taken out to a firing range. He bought it because it looked cool, his own words, basically, because his friend had it. So not an experienced guy, by any account. Anyway, turns out when he was there that night, he actually did provide medical aid to a couple of people and did put out fires, and, multiple witness testimonies, like fixing people's legs, that kind of thing. So he was in that to do that as far as we can tell. But then there's this other narrative that, of course, the prosecution is trying to make their case around, which is he went out there spoiling for a fight. Why did he bring an AR-15 if he wasn't not necessarily intending on getting into a fight, but at least open to the possibility of a fight? Because again, like I said, Antifa, Proud Boys, there was this back and forth between these out in the street groups. And I understand people making arguments that there's this culture where people are looking for it and, we got to get out there and defend it. And the police were ordered to stand down, which is, of course, a big fact. The police had effectively, they'd set up barricades. Yeah. But that night, the night before, as in many other cities, they weren't intervening because these protests are all about police violence. And therefore, mayors and such, or governors are wanting the police not to do that kind of thing. Anyway, that all ties together. I can see different sides of it, but I've been trying to talk for a while now, set up the case at least. Jamarl, you've only watched a little bit. We're taking anybody's calls if you guys want to talk about it. 202-521-1320. Jamarl, what do you think about this case?
So 2 things. The first one is, I do think he went spoiling for a fight. He took a gun over state lines in order to get into a conflict that was clearly a conflict. As you said, it was a situation where these guys were basically like taking a city or whatever, taking a town. And there was clear conflict between what seemed to be 2 groups. You had either Antifa, you had some people who were there for Black Lives Matter, you had people who were there protesting, just maybe protesting other stuff. And a lot of the conflict was getting violent, meaning back and forth between the 2 groups. And so it's like, if you're going to that, you have to, on some level, get and recognize that it's a violent situation that you're implicating yourself into. And I would say the evidence of that, he bought a gun. I mean, why bring a gun if you didn't necessarily think that you might have the potential to use that gun, or at the very least, you didn't, at the very least, knew that this was a dangerous situation that you were putting yourself into. By the same token, in the way that the case is being run, everybody that I've talked to that's watched this case thought the prosecution was the defense. Meaning, if you ever watched the case with Trayvon Martin, it looked as if the prosecution was putting on that case almost perfunctory. Just like, okay, people are angry, so we need to do something about it, so we're going to put on this case. I don't necessarily think that the prosecution is going to that length where it's a showboat trial, but it seems like their capability of getting across various elements seems to be lacking. Part of that had to do with bringing the gun into the state. Apparently, they were saying that he didn't bring it into the state. It was something that he picked up when he was there, which means that that particular charge gets thrown away. I don't even think they brought evidence against that, so that's tossed. And even when you go further into it, it made it look as if the prosecution was having a hard time, A, communicating that this guy was spoiling for a fight, A, but also where they were making certain arguments where the judge was basically chastising them for making various arguments. So it basically looked like the prosecution wasn't necessarily doing a good job in this case. And many people who even think he's guilty look at this and think, it looks like he's going to get off. So I don't know. I mean, the people that I've talked to on this, whether they believe he's guilty or not, it's almost secondary to the point that they think the prosecution is doing a horrible job in presenting this case. So much so that they think Rittenhouse has a pretty decent chance of skating on this.
Right now, I'm leaning towards not guilty on the felony counts.
Yeah.
But if the prosecution had done a better job, maybe that'd be different, because I was just watching the trial. It's not like I'm having behind-the-scenes conversations with people who are trying to sway my opinion on this. I'm literally just watching the trial, trying to figure this stuff out,
It tells me one particular moment where the prosecution is, we talked about this one, where the prosecution is basically asking questions about, they're trying to make it seem as he went there spoiling for a fight. That he was going to, fight these people. He bought the gun and everything else for that particular reason. And when they asked the guy, well, did he pull a gun on you before you did anything? And he was like, no. And the prosecution drops his head in his hand because he gets that the point that the people are making or the defense is making is, well, he didn't do this until he was basically attacked.
And the problem is it's a kind of a video-oriented clip, but there's like a minute-long segment that came out early last week with that specific interchange, that interaction, where it's like a minute, where the guy that they call as the witness, the Gage Grosskreutz, the one who has not died, the third guy who had a part of his arm blown off after Rittenhouse shot him once in the arm.
Right.
They call him to testify, and of course the defense is going after him. And what really screws him up is he completely reverses himself. Yeah. He says one thing, and then the defense asks him a couple of questions, not that many. And then he literally says the exact opposite of the thing he'd said 40 seconds earlier, which originally he says that Rittenhouse does not, he didn't fire at me because I pointed my gun at him. Mm-hmm. That's the key thing, right?
Yeah.
Whether this guy's pointing his gun at him, which would make it self-defense, because if Rittenhouse doesn't fire at him until the guy points his gun at him very clearly, and Rittenhouse again.
After he whacked two people.
Well, it's after he whacked two people, but Rittenhouse is lying on the ground, back on the ground, basically waiting for this dude effectively, as far as I remember it. You can see clips of it. Mm-hmm. He doesn't shoot at him when the dude has his arms in the air, but when Gage Grosskreutz drops the hand holding the gun and points it at him, that's when he fires. So that's critical. Another thing, and I just want to come back to this. This is clearly a matter of some dispute, so I don't want to act as if, but, you bring a gun for self-protection. Bringing an AR-15 is a pretty darn excessive thing, and I get that would arouse some anger. He says that he couldn't bring a handgun because of his age. And then this brings in the whole matter, wait, so you're 17 and you've taken it upon yourself to go out and do this stuff. Is that really such a good idea? Now, if the police have withdrawn, this is a whole cultural issue. There are the Gage Grosskreutz guy he shot. Guess what? That guy was a field medic. Mm-hmm. He brought a handgun with him. He was of age. So he sort of fits all those criteria in some senses. But at the end of the day, Rittenhouse is the one who shot him. Here's the other thing. The first guy, Jacob Rosenbaum, the first one who got shot, had earlier in the night told Rittenhouse when he was alone with a friend of his, I'm forgetting the guy's name, Nick something. He told them, one of his friends, because he was with several people at the scene. He told them, if I get you alone, I'm going to kill you. He told them that. He also told them in a separate point in the night when they were in a group, and parts of this I can't say, if I see any of you bleeps out there, I will cut your heart out.
Yeah.
So he'd said those kinds of things earlier in the night, the first guy.
Now, do we know he said that, or is that what Rittenhouse says?
You have witnesses saying it. And with those, as far as I know, you don't have them in any of the videos, but you have other witnesses saying it. So Rittenhouse, later on in the night, he's heard that same guy saying it.
Oh,
we think he's heard that same guy saying it.
I mean, basically, that's what they're saying. I guess, who are the witnesses, though? Are they witnesses for the defense or the prosecution?
I would need to go back and look at it, but I believe it's for the defense, as it would be. You know, it makes sense. The prosecution wouldn't want to call on those guys unless they dramatically surprise him, of course.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're taking your calls. I don't want to keep this close too long. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Let's go to Michael, calling in from Silver Spring, talking about the Kyle Rittenhouse trial. Michael, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hi. I'm not sure about the details, but I feel like there's something much, much larger than this, which is it shouldn't be this complicated, in my opinion. I mean, regardless of the decision, if it's unclear, how many times is this happening per day across the planet, or especially in the United States, and regardless of the outcome of this trial, what difference? I mean, I'm sorry for the victims.
Because sometimes it's self-defense and other times it's murder. And that's the crucial point, is that in the use of violence, I think,
there's a difference in those things.
It has to be justified. Again, if somebody's attacking you and you kill them because they're attacking you, our law broadly defends that and sanctions that kind of thing. It allows that to happen. Whereas, of course, if you go out and aggress against somebody else, and you need to distinguish between the two, and often in these cases, you have all these complicated factors that come in, so those details really do matter. When you call in and you say that you don't need the details in the case, but it's too complicated, well, it's complicated for a reason. They're trying to figure out who's guilty and who's innocent. And maybe lawyers will make it overcomplicated in some cases, maybe, but it's just complicated.
Yeah, I think this one, I mean, look, to me, you had a child who basically decided he wanted to go into another state to get involved in what is clearly violence. I mean, it was just conflict. I mean, even if you're looking at people who were there, you had some people with guns. You had some people who were basically given refreshments and whatnot. You had cops sitting there with their armed, military equipment and everything else. He had to know that what he was going into wasn't safe. Otherwise, why bring the gun? Or why end up with a handgun? By the same token, is there a difference between, yes, he put himself in a situation where he was in the midst of violence. By the same token, he didn't do anything to basically proactively attack somebody.
But that's
the question.
I don't believe he did. That's the thing. Looking at it, I don't see where he went out at going to aggress. What he did was when Jacob Rosenbaum, when Kyle was on his own, he'd gotten separated from his friend. He was trying to get back to this department thing. Mm-hmm. The police had cordoned off a section, so he was kind of having to go a new way. Plus, he was still trying to put out fires. Anyway, Kyle was on his own at this point, later in the night. Jacob Rosenbaum runs up behind him, is chasing after him. Kyle repeatedly, points the gun at him and then runs, and as if to be like, hey, I will shoot you if you come closer, but I'm still trying to get up distance. And then at a certain point, Kyle cuts into this massive cars. You can see all the video of that first shooting. Mm-hmm. Cuts into a massive cars. There are people on the other sides of the cars sort of blocking exits, and it's like multiple cars parked, kind of like a little maze. It's at that point when he's sort of trapped. Rosenbaum approaches. Kyle spins around. Rosenbaum puts his hand on Kyle's gun as if to grab it. And at that point, Kyle shoots 4 times, not once, 4 times. So I'm trying to lay it all out, both the whatever, good and bad or whatever. I'm trying to lay out all the facts. We have other callers too, though. That's when that starts. So it's not, as far as I can tell, again, it wasn't that he was going to seek it out. But 202-521-1320 is the number. We have Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, what's up, guys? I would have to say if Kyle Rittenhouse was black, man, they would be. And it's funny to even make this point, but if Kyle was black, the media and everybody would be on his side and saying right now he's being lynched and then at the time when they were attacking him, he's being lynched and all kinds of stuff like that, right? And you guys know me, I obviously fall typically on the left side of the fence with stuff, if not the independent. But there was just too much footage out showing, even the exchange you were talking about, where they were chasing him down the street. He was actively trying to get away from them, and then he ran down that one section that you brought up where the roads were blocked off, and then they were trying to get him then. And then even the footage of him laying on the ground, and they were trying to jump on him and attack him. There's footage of them shouting, get that MFer, get that MFer. There's a footage that Shane brought up. There's footage of that testimony. There's footage of that actual bits of that conversation. There's footage of one of the guys who I think he was the one that got killed, who had the charges for some kind of sexual crime he had committed back in the day, whatever the case is, where he was in a group of people talking about, effing up the city and effing things up and messing stuff up. You know what I'm saying? So there's a lot of footage to show, the violence of people that caught those rounds, right? And then most importantly, if you look at the footage of Kyle Rittenhouse on the ground when he's shooting, those are controlled shots like that. Like I saw that a bit in the news saying that he wasn't trained. No, that kid was very well trained using a firearm. There's video footage from his Facebook page that was circulating back when this stuff first happened, showing him practicing. I'm not saying that against him. I'm saying that in his defense.
He hadn't taken that, real quick, Brave, he had not taken the AR-15 out to the shooting range as the prosecution sort of pushed him on when they started to ask him these questions. That was what I brought up there.
No, I got you on that. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that particular weapon. Nothing. They were talking about this particular weapon. What I'm saying is there's footage of him back in the day training with weapons, training not at an actual range, but trying to train like in a backyard with an area somewhere, like shooting at targets and stuff, and was pretty skilled. And I'm not saying that against him. I'm saying that to his credit.
Well, totally. And if you look at that footage, and I remember people making comments both after it came out, kind of crudely in my opinion, but also more recently as it pertains to the trial. He has good trigger discipline and firearm discipline. And in the footage, he has like his gun pointed at the ground, finger off the trigger, all that stuff.
Yeah, I've been in service with people that didn't have that kind of control, right? Mm-hmm. People were jumping on him, and his shots were controlled. Like even when I mean, consider you're a regular person, a 17-year-old kid. And let me make this point real quick. Also, the difference between having a pistol and the AR is that the AR is considered a rifle, and you can be under a certain age to carry a rifle because the AR is considered a rifle. That's why he's able to carry it, right? I'm not getting into the thing of whether he brought it across the lines or anything like that. And I think one of the points that should be made is there was plenty of video on CNN and other places that had nothing to do with the Kyle Rittenhouse thing, where they were interviewing people who had came from other places to help defend businesses, whether it was minority businesses, white business, whatever. And they had plenty of people who were minorities, white people, all kinds of people who were out setting up and defending businesses and standing guard in front of business, and they all had weapons. I remember a very specific interview. They were talking to a guy, I think he was like Samoan. He looked like he was Samoan or something like that. I don't know, maybe race, he might have been Hispanic, I don't know. But this guy had a sweet tactical AR, and they were just interviewing him.
But Brave, here I want to cut in, and I like your call, and so I'm not trying to cut it off, but I also want to cut in to play devil's advocate for a second. You've heard my take on this. I think broadly he's not guilty of the felonies, but at the same time, I thought the most damning moment of the for the prosecution, not of the whole trial, but and maybe it's not the most. I thought it was a moment, of course, is when they brought up his TikTok page, Kyle Rittenhouse's TikTok page, and I'm not even going to say what the username is. Like, I don't think I can, based on FCC law, but I will say what his bio was, which is, bruh, I'm just trying to be famous. That was Kyle Rittenhouse's TikTok bio. Yeah. Bruh, I'm just trying to be famous. So for people, again, it's not like damning, but you hear my point. That's like a moment. Isn't he kind of looking for something here? What's your take on that idea, Brave?
I don't know. I can't give it that because, first of all, everybody's got a social media, and everybody's on social media because they want people to know their stories and know them. And everybody wants to be famous, especially when you're a kid, right? Yeah. I don't think I can't say that has anything to do with it. And as far as looking for something, I don't know. If I mean, in any other case with anybody else, we say, well, we can't see what's inside of their heart. That's what we say, right? But in this case, what was clear and what was said is that he went to defend businesses. There were other people that went to defend and help out. And even the one cat that he shot, I think, if I remember correctly, this is back when it happened, there was footage of him helping to give first aid to a person after he had shot him with the other guy. You're talking about with the
yeah, it's the first. Well, it's the first one he's trying to. Is that but he kind of doesn't. It's weird. The first guy, Jacob Rosenbaum, the first incident, like, is the one I mentioned with the cars, the maze of cars little thing. So he shoots him 4 times. He's in shock. He moves around to the other side. People start freaking out. Another person runs up. He runs over and is sort of standing over the body, frenetically looking around. And he says, I was getting ready to provide medical aid. He calls up his friend, like his best friend, the guy I came down with, Nick something, he's separated from at this point. But he calls him and tells him, I just killed somebody, basically. Yeah. And then Kyle says, as he's going to provide medical aid to Jacob Rosenbaum, guy he just shot and ended up killing, the crowd that had backed off, surrounding the cars, had backed off when he shot, they start coming. They start running.
You just killed somebody.
Exactly. He just killed somebody. And so he's like, at that point, I didn't feel safe, and he started to run away. That was my interjection there, Brave. I'm just trying to, because for people who haven't seen the footage, don't know all the facts, I'm trying to sort of spell out factually the case and actually what happened. But Brave, you were saying something.
I would just say that people should go back and just Google some of the older footage from back when this stuff happened. It was a lot of footage. And I remember watching it then, and I was like, this kid is first of all, this kid is being more responsible than adults I know, right? A 17-year-old kid who has just been attacked and has had to take lives to protect himself, right? And then made those shots with control, meaning to be careful not to kill anybody, and then was taking those shots to be control of who he was shooting. That kid is being more responsible than many adults that I know, and then you have to consider the fact that he's 17 in the midst of all this.
Mm-hmm. And the kid is, again, Kyle Rittenhouse. The defense played this up, and the prosecution could not counter it. They tried to bring up video games. Kyle Rittenhouse, like an EMT cadet, firehouse cadet, all these volunteering things. He worked as a lifeguard. They just paint him as like a young, slightly naive, immature model young man kind of a thing. That's how the defense paints him. And then the prosecution coming in and weirdly bringing up video games and even the TikTok thing, which I thought was a moment, just wasn't enough to counter that idea that overall his heart wasn't in a horrible place. He didn't have it out for people.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess to me, the most damning thing is not, look, I can forgive people for having provocative, names on TikTok or Twitter or Facebook or something like that. And even, some of the videos that people may make, it may not necessarily be indicative of the person thinking of something forethought. Like who knew there was going to be this massive protest, and who knew, was he thinking about this stuff at the time when he created his social media account? No, I think the damning thing is the fact that he went knowing that it was going to be this kind of violent clash in and of itself. I think that's the issue more than anything else. I mean, like you said, I don't necessarily know what was in his head when he was there for it. I do know he understood that he was in some level of danger. Otherwise, you wouldn't even take the weapon. I don't even know the conversations that they were having amongst themselves when all of the stuff was basically starting off on. So that's fair. But I don't know. I mean, I would say the last killing, at the point where people start crowding you, well, at that point, yeah, you are apprehensive. You are edgy at that point, especially after you've just killed two people.
The second two killings, because the second killing was also the second dude had a skateboard with him, was bludgeoning him across the neck, and then Kyle had been knocked to the floor, and the dude had his boot and was slamming on his head. And so Kyle's thought was, it's a reasonable thought, if I lose consciousness, he's not going to stop slamming on my head, and he's going to kill me. So in my opinion, that's the thing, and that's why I say defense paints a neat case here. The first case where it's a killing, he's chased into a dead end after repeatedly warning the dude, and then he shoots him.
Yeah.
Second case, the dude's banging him on the floor with a boot. Mm-hmm. Justified.
Yeah.
Third case, again, you need to look into Gage Grosskreutz. Runs up to him with a pistol, swings the pistol around as if to shoot him, and it's at that point that Kyle Rittenhouse shoots him. In other words, in the three shootings, in each one of them, I see the justification. I see why the self-defense comes in. But what I'm left with, and what I started with when we were talking about it late last week, is the ultimate, and it's the basic common sense thing that everybody's left with, and what makes this story so interesting. He's a 17-year-old who takes it upon himself to go out and do all this stuff because the police aren't around. He brings an AR-15 with him, and yet he's also providing medical aid. It's this complicated, interesting thing it opens up all these other doors. Yeah. You know what? This obviously, the whole door this opens up, we haven't even gotten to yet. The police. Why the police weren't there? This whole conversation about policing.
But they were there.
Kyle Rittenhouse, yeah, but they weren't intervening. And the thing is, this is after the previous night. Businesses not too far from where his dad lives.
Yeah.
Businesses getting destroyed, torched, nobody really protecting them. And so then these people come out to protect them. He's part of this crew. You see what I'm saying? The police aren't intervening at the critical periods when people locally want them to intervene.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it really interesting, because that was what a lot of people were talking about last year. And we sort of, like the BLM accurate complaints about problems with policing and corruption and all that stuff, we never really actually addressed that one. Anyway, we have another caller too.
Go for it.
We have Anthony calling in from Detroit. Anthony, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Yo, good morning. I don't know if you guys can hear me pretty good. I'm coming down the staircase.
Yeah, pretty well. Go for it, Anthony.
Oh, yeah. Cool. I just wanted to, I just had to, because it might seem nitpicky, but...
Anthony, it is getting worse. It is deteriorating as you're continuing to go down the staircase. I'm sorry, man. Please call back in.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, we can actually. Go for it, Anthony.
Okay, yeah. I just, it might seem nitpicky, but I had to point out the asterisk earlier, shame that you put on the word kid with regard to the Pentagon.
Yeah, the drone killing. Yep.
Sure, because it reminded me of Dave Chappelle's joke, I think about Ashley, this little white girl that got lost, and I forget what other black boy. But yeah, it just reminded me of it. I just kind of wanted to point it out because I thought it was funny. And also, I mean, ironic because we were just talking about, what's his name? Kyle Rittenhouse, and calling him a kid a couple of times too. So yeah, I just want to point that out though.
It's true. It's true. No, you're completely accurate. And thank you for that, Anthony. Thank you. Probably hypocrisy on my part in a sort of subtle way there, noticing that on the one hand and not on the other. I will admit to that completely. No, valid. I know with the other one, I was just trying to be accurate. I said kid, and what I don't want to get into people's idea is the idea that these are all like 9-year-olds, when in fact some of them are teens and older teens. I don't want to be factually misleading. We'd already said with Kyle that he was 17 a couple of times, but
yeah, I always call. I mean, to me, if you're under 17, you're a kid to me, or if you're 17, you're a kid.
Yeah.
Because like it's like with the Pentagon, we're like thinking baby, like the Pentagon would want to frame it as. Or excuse me, like we like not as baby. Oh, they're not babies. These are what like same thing when it's a 17-year-old black male on the street. It's like, oh, these are
exactly. They try to frame it older, and so I will admit to the hypocrisy totally. That might be there subtly. I will not say that. I don't know, but I admit I welcome the criticism. And anything else, Anthony?
Thanks for taking the call, though.
No, thank you, Anthony. We have Malik calling in from D.C. Malik, you're on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey there, Jamal. You're on point, my brother. You're on point today. No, I think Jamal, you make a great point. I'd like to go a little bit further. I haven't trained with an enormous amount of firearms, but I have used an AR-15 before, and as I was using the AR-15, I was well aware that it was a weapon of war.
Right.
Right. And it's I've used the Glock before, and was well aware that that's also a weapon of war. We could say that it's more for day-to-day self-defense, and it's not necessarily the same category, but an AR-15 is completely different, and I think. Brother Brave, I understand the objective points that he's making about this case. Your last caller made the obvious point about race. I don't think we need to really rehash that. I think we all know that for black youth in this country, people have called for their blood for much less. I think it's preposterous to have these conversations about, Kyle Rittenhouse donating his time and he was, I think he went there trying to get action. We've all been, we're all men. We've all been young boys before. We know what it's like to be young men growing into adulthood, and we've been around. If we weren't that way, we've been around young men who. Are those types that are constantly looking for something to get into, to prove themselves as men. And I think for us to, obviously the case is going the direction that it's going. It looks like he's not going to get any felony charges. I think it's preposterous the way the judge is showing his clear bias.
Yeah, that too. I keep hearing that too. Yeah. I'm curious, what do you think? I mean, I think to me, if you're going to go into a war zone or a zone that is basically full of, violence and conflict, on some level, what are you expecting to take place when you go? I mean, that's kind of where I am on that. What's your last comment, Malik, before we go?
Jamal, I think, and that wasn't there were several incidents around that time of white males who went to these protests with the specific interest in engaging violently, whether it be Antifa.
All three of the people he shot were white, though. You're saying he's a white male. If he went out there looking to get into a racial conflict, why did he kill white people?
He didn't say racial.
Yeah, but then what's the relevance of him being a white male?
Well, no. The relevance of that is that white males have complete democratic space within this country.
Malik, we're literally out of time. We got to go. I just want to let you get that last bit in. We'll be back in a minute with headlines. Listening to Fault Lines. Be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it's time now for the last hour this morning of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I'm your indefatigable, your last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And that means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning, everybody. Once again, it's just past 9 a.m. Eastern. It's November 15th. Boy, I tell you, Jamarl, it would be fun to just let Malik and Brave have an argument about that one because they're both on their sides on it. I don't know.
It didn't seem like they were arguing too much.
No, they're not with each other. It's just they've got very different takes.
Yeah.
I'm sure they would. It would be an interesting conversation too. Anyway. Let's get into headlines. First up, in COVID stats and COVID news. Yesterday in the United States, there were 25,411 new COVID cases reported, also 464 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 80,885 cases per day. That's an increase of 11% from the average 2 weeks ago. 59% of the total American public has now been fully vaccinated. 68% of residents have received at least one dose of a COVID vaccine. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 47,036,751 people across the United States. It has killed 761,980 people here in the U.S. In national news, 500 National Guard troops have been set on standby as attorneys in the Kyle Rittenhouse case prepare to make their closing arguments today. The troops are stationed outside of Kenosha, Wisconsin, ahead of a possible verdict. Closing arguments will be given for up to 5 hours today, and the jury of 8 men and 10 women will be narrowed to 12 by a drawing of names. A federal grand jury has returned an indictment against former Donald Trump advisor Steve Bannon for contempt of Congress over his defiance of a subpoena from the Select Committee investigating the January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol. The indictment sets off what will likely be a contentious legal battle with significant ramifications for the January 6th committee as it seeks to compel other witnesses to testify about the events leading up to the attempted insurrection, quote-unquote. In international news, President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping will meet in a virtual summit on Monday evening amid rising economic and military tensions. Administration officials said the virtual meeting was meant to reassure both sides that misunderstandings and miscommunications would not lead to unintended clashes. Former ambassador to the UN and former governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson, said the American diplomat Danny Fenster had been released from custody by Myanmar and would be traveling back to the United States by way of Qatar. This comes after Fenster, who founded the magazine Frontier Myanmar, was convicted Friday of spreading false or inflammatory information. In Egypt, heavy rain and thunderstorms in the city of Aswan has left 3 people dead and 500 injured. The storms forced scorpions from their hiding places into many houses across the province. At least 503 people were hospitalized after suffering scorpion stings. All patients were discharged after receiving antivenom doses. In holiday news, in terms of what holidays it is today, today is Steve Irwin Day, American Education Week, Book Week Scotland, Geography Awareness Week, and National Young Readers Week. And with that, those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And Steve Irwin Day is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a celebration of the late, great crocodile hunter, Steve Irwin. Well, I was never, just a guy.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Very wild.
Very wild.
I swear, man, a holiday for pretty much anything. It doesn't matter what it is. It undermines the other holidays. It's like, so what, Thanksgiving is a holiday or Christmas is a holiday when you have Steve Irving Day? Also, that's considered a holiday. I don't know. Teach his own. I mean, I would aware there's somebody out there who's celebrating that particular day vociferously.
You got to have the ambition to have your own holiday.
Exactly.
That's when you know you've made it.
Exactly. We're going to have to get somebody to talk about the legalities of this case. Because I think there are 2 components. I think there's the legality part, and I think there's kind of the optics part. And like I said, even people who think he's guilty of sin look at this case and think to themselves, looks like the prosecution is not doing great here. And, that was the impression that everybody that I've talked to about it came away with it.
Can I make it? Did you ever watch Game of Thrones?
Loved it.
Truly silly point. I loved it too. Although I've had a harder time rewatching it with other people. I tried to get Jack into it, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And it was kind of both of us at that point. But
it got slow after a while.
It did. And, you know, there's the whole famous downturn after season 5 or 4 or whatever, you know, whenever you want to put the mark, but when it starts to get bad.
Yeah.
Badder, worse. Anyway, you know, Littlefinger?
Yes.
Lord Baelish?
Yeah.
This a prosecuting attorney, the prosecution is like, has the sort of smarminess of Lord Baelish, but he's like a sigma or 2 less intelligent. He's like significantly less smart, and he's citified and kind of cosmopolitan. But he looks pretty similar to him, and this is all a super superficial appraisal of the dude. He looks sort of similar to him, but he also has that kind of like arrogant, condescending. He assumes that you're just going to agree with him, and if you don't, you're a fool.
Yeah.
And if you think about that energy going up to a more conservative-leaning judge, who's like, I'm not going to take any of that.
Just doesn't go
You
well.
get the dynamic. And so I'm sure the judge has biases. But my thing with criticizing the prosecution on this, why I think it's more relevant, I feel like unless the judge is making calls about what's to be admitted or not to be admitted as evidence, which is a separate matter from, you know, his personal biases or him making comments about Asian food or whatever, or celebrating the single veteran that the defense called in, whatever.
They applauded that guy before he came in or something. Like
Yeah, exactly.
It's just uber weird stuff.
But my point is, all those biases, the jury sees that. But and again, unless he's holding evidence back, like, they're relying on the prosecution to make the convicting argument. They're relying on the prosecution to prove, you know, the inculpating case that this guy is guilty of doing the things that you think he's guilty of doing. The judge, although you'd hope that he's going to be impartial, I feel like he's a little bit less of a factor because the jury can kind of take that into account with the prosecution. If the prosecution's failing, then it's like you're just missing one side of the spectrum. You don't have the offense, you only have the defense. And so I would say that his failure is a more crucial one for the case.
And look, it's part of the prosecution's job not to piss off the judge. I mean, that's just kind of comes along with it. I mean, you're going to have some judges that are far more hostile in regards to your case and other cases. And so that can't necessarily be used in and of itself as an excuse unless the judge is just being like over the top belligerent in the way that he's going with the case. But the judge clearly has a take. But yeah, the prosecution can't. Look, if you're going to make the judge angry with you, you're giving yourself a hard way to go.
And some of the stuff, I'm not pretending to be a legal expert, but like it seemed like it was very predictable that the judge would get pissed about this sort of thing. I brought up the 2 instances the day that I was watching.
Look, man, if a judge tells you don't do X, and you turn around and does X, he is going to lose it.
Yes.
I've yet to come across a judge that hasn't.
It's after the dude had done something else. The judge had to like basically go into break on like 3. He only went into break kind of on 2 separate occasions.
Mm-hmm.
But then there was a third occasion because, of course, you know, the prosecution pursues something, the defense objects to it, and it's at that point that they go to a sort of deliberative process where the jury leaves the room.
Right, and they work through the case.
And they work through, okay, whatever the facts of the matter is. The 2 instances where the judge did that, the main day that I was watching with the Kyle case, pardon me, it was egregious.
Yeah.
The first time, it was, again, over Fifth Amendment right stuff that Kyle, again, has as rights. The right to remain silent about the facts of the case until you go on trial.
You're saying they're trying to use that against him.
The prosecution is basically presuming, and it's very clear if you go back and listen to it, that is indicative of guilt. That because he's being silent about it, it's, he's guilty, and why aren't you going to talk? Why didn't you talk about it? Well, no, the client has every right. Miranda rights. You have every right to remain silent. You have every right.
Again,
in fact,
that's just good sense.
Super important.
You don't talk to the cops.
Exactly.
I swear to God, like, I get that some people want to say, well, why didn't the person tell their side of the story? That is stupid talk.
Yep.
I mean, at the end of the day, if a cop thinks you did something, their framing of reference is that you're guilty. And there is literally nothing that you can do in that room of interrogation that is in your benefit. Zero. I mean, even this premise of, you know, anything that you say can and will be used against you, even if you tell the cop something that's true, the cop is not going to bring it into court because it'll be called hearsay. The only thing that can be used in court is basically things against you. And so it's all the good sense in the world, whatever you want to think of Kyle Rittenhouse or whatever I think of Kyle Rittenhouse, just shut up.
Just be quiet about it.
Just shut up. Go talk to your lawyer. Tell your lawyer.
That's the standard thing to do. So my point is, that was the first big thing the day of, because I was watching pretty much the entirety until the very tail end of Rittenhouse's testimony, because it's fascinating, and I wanted to get it. You know, this is the chance to hear the dude anyway.
Yeah.
So that was the first instance. The second instance I also brought up last week. I'll briefly restate it again now. The guy's wanting to bring in a piece of evidence that the judge had earlier in the day and repeatedly said shouldn't be brought in. Specifically, it was a photo of Kyle Rittenhouse at a bar in December, I believe it was, last year, after all this had happened, some months later, you know. Might have been January of this year, but irrelevant, month difference. Anyway, at a bar, Kyle's arm is around a dude. They're taking a picture together. It's almost like from CCTV footage in the bar or something like that. The other dude's face is blacked out. All you can see is Kyle, really, with a shirt on that says free as F, et cetera. The word free as F, basically. So he's wearing that shirt on, basically makes him look bad. Prosecution wants to bring that into the case. The judge had previously ruled that that was completely irrelevant to the case because it happened months later. It happened after. And so it doesn't pertain to the mindset of Kyle at the night of or leading up to it.
Has no bearing.
Has no
on
bearing
anything that took place on
which makes sense to me completely. So he had ruled it out. Then the prosecution, after he'd already gotten the warning from the judge, and it was a serious scolding. It wasn't a yelling at that point, but it was like a harsh scolding, like, if you do this kind of thing again, I'm telling you, you're going to be, I'm telling you, I might rule a mistrial, that kind of thing. He does this motion, he does this other move again later. Defense, of course, objects to it, jury leaves out of the room, and the judge starts yelling at him.
Just goes after him.
Goes after him. But it's also because the prosecution, he's talking to the judge, and he's kind of like cutting in. He's doing the condescending thing where he's like, well, no, actually, I see it this way.
The judge is not going to tolerate that.
The judge is not going to tolerate that.
I've seen enough of these cases, He's not going to tolerate that at all. I mean, they're not going to tolerate just kind of undermining of their power in that court. And honestly, it doesn't really apply. I mean, if the prosecution's key argument is that basically Rittenhouse went there with the notion of starting some kind of conflict. And if you're going to say, okay, well, look, he went to this particular place. He knew he was going into this kind of violent area. He arms himself in doing so, which gives cognizance to thought that it's going to be a violent area. What does him wearing a shirt after the fact have anything to do with that case? And if the defense case is, look, he was under attack, he defended himself. Again, that shirt has nothing to do with either of their point of view in regards to the case. So the judge, I don't think, is necessarily wrong in killing it. I think what the prosecution is trying to get in is this notion of frame of mind. What is it called? Mens rea. What is it in his head at the particular moment that he's doing this stuff or that the things were taking place? But the problem for the prosecution is you have to be able to show that in something that takes place beforehand, not after. Like if you had a video of him saying, I'm going to go and blow these people away. Okay, then you should play that video because that's pertinent to what's taking place as it leads up to it. But it doesn't sound like any of this stuff is pertinent to the case.
See, and here's the other thing. I get where it doesn't. And the defense, the prosecution would need to counter the defense's case, which is he was a good Samaritan who wanted to show up to give medical assistance and to put out fires.
You need to show he wasn't and that he was there for some kind of violence.
Now, admittedly, the optics of a random 17-year-old chunky white dude carrying an AR-15 slung around his back during Black Lives Matter protests last year is bad optics.
Yes.
Very bad optics. But defense very consistently made this case. It makes sense. Prosecution has done nothing. And Malik, assuming you're still here, assuming you're still listening at least, I feel like you guys got to make a little bit more. Where do you actually see? I get the optics. Okay, some random dude with an AR-15. But guess what? He was he was sort of with a group. He'd gone out with, I think, one or two friends of his. They'd also brought guns. He separated to go do the medical assistance thing. He was with a group of people who are more hardcore and were just like hanging around with guns, protecting this car source, this car lot thing that they, this car sales lot that they first showed up to protect, basically maintenance site, that kind of thing. Anyway, they're all hanging out. Kyle is going out doing the medical assistance thing. In other words, his family lives there. My point is, if the frame on him is he's a Proud Boy-esque young white vigilante style dude, why is he giving medical assistance to the protesters?
Oh, I don't know what he was.
And they got to counter that. My point is, I'm not initially pushing you guys. I'm saying the prosecution or anybody who wants to make the case that he had it out for people.
It's like they need to show.
They got to show it. You got to show it. It's just him being a young white male, and the idea. I get that juries, by and large, are going to lean in subtle ways, but factually, we got to get into the actual case, and I got to see, like, okay, you got to counter these sides, these arguments, the facts on this other side, because if you don't do that, I get the optics of it, but if you look at the facts, he seemed like he didn't have it out for people. He didn't seem like he was trying to go out and kill people.
I got to be honest, I don't know. I mean, whether he went there with intention, I'm going to put a bullet in somebody, I think it's less relevant than did you end up putting a bullet in somebody? Meaning, did you put yourself in a situation that you knew was going to be harmful or potentially get you in a hot water? The answer is yes. I don't even know how that's defended against. He went to somewhere that he clearly knew, outside of his own state, mind you, that he clearly knew was going to be some level of violent action. So there's that part. Whether he went there with the whole point of, I'm going to kill somebody when I come here, I think that's different. I mean, there's all sorts of things that people could get into trouble on where they basically say, okay, this is second-degree murder because the person put themselves in a situation that they knew was going to be violent without having the capacity to extricate themselves from it. From the standpoint of him being white or something like that, the optics to me isn't. I mean, there were a lot of people who basically was going to defend the various places. I guess my thing is the group that he was hanging out with that was more hardcore. Did the other people know? Meaning, because it works both ways, right? If you're with a bunch of people who seem to be...
And that was part of it.
Yeah.
Yes, is that there had been some interactions earlier in the night between the protesters and the group that he was with. They never got violent, but one of the people in the group that he was with had said something like, keep saying that and you'll see what happens. Something like that, where it's kind of intimidating and there's a very clear boundary between the two groups. And so, prosecution brought that up at a couple of points.
Yeah.
On the other hand, Kyle walking around, here's another thing. Walking around, it's dark out. You don't know exactly who's there. He's at a couple of points yelling stuff like friendly, friendly, friendly. He's yelling this out to random protesters as he's walking by. In other words, trying to very clearly signal, I don't have it out for anybody, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just trying to lay out both sides of it as I see them.
When he's saying friendly, who is he saying friendly to?
A couple of different, it happens twice as far as it got brought up in the trial. Both as he's walking around. And both it's like groups of people who are 30, 40 feet away who from everything, makes sense. He's just very clearly trying to signal, I'm friendly. I don't have any dog in this hunt. I'm just walking around friendly despite having an AR-15 on my back is sort of the unspoken subtext, I think.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, we'll see. Personally, I think he put himself into a violent situation. Whether he went there with the intention of killing anybody, who knows? I would hope he didn't. I mean, because that's drastic, to put it mildly, for a 17-year-old going into that situation. I can craft in my head this notion of, okay, I'm going to defend this particular area because I don't want this particular area to go into disrepute.
And my dad lives right by there, a couple blocks away. It's like my family lives right by there. I don't want to spill it over into suburban neighborhoods or something
so
like that.
I can kind of see the framing of mind in that particular situation.
Or
but
I don't want
fires on defending.
I don't want to, and this is the other thing, he's putting out fires, or I don't want somebody to set on fire that's going to light the whole neighborhood on fire and burn down my family's home. There are other sides of it, too.
How was he planning on defending that neighborhood?
He had a fire extinguisher and a med kit with him.
And a weapon, of course.
And a weapon. Yeah. But the main thing, as far as I can tell, that he says he was planning on going out to do, obviously, was provide medical assistance and put out fires. Very consistently. Defense hammered it, and when he was answering questions asked by the prosecution, I wanted to go out to put out fires and provide medical aid.
Well, I hope he doesn't come out and say, I came to kill somebody.
Of course not. My point is, he says that, and all of the evidence that night leading up to the shootings supports that completely. He's providing medical aid to multiple people. You can see him on footage running around with a fire extinguisher going out to put out fires. It's all right there. Anyway, we have Mark Sloboda on the line. We have our next guest. We've been talking about this for a little while now. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst, we'll be speaking with when we come back. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Excuse me. If you guys live in the area, you can always catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. We have a few issues to hit on today. I still want to go into the Biden-Xi Jinping virtual summit, and I also want to get into what the various sides in the conflict between Belarus the European Union, Russian, Poland, etc., want out of that particular conflict. In addition to having a conversation about Ethiopia and the conflict and the way that it's breaking down, in addition to the way mainstream media is basically running this kind of weird propaganda campaign on behalf of the TPLF. But let's start with the first one, Biden and Xi Jinping. To have a conversation about it, we're joined with Mark Sloboda. He's an international relations and security analyst. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Jamarl, Shane, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
It's always an honor and privilege to have you. One of my favorite guests, so thank you for joining us. So let's get into the meeting with Xi Jinping, the summit, the virtual summit between Biden and Xi Jinping. In this case, Xi Jinping is basically warning Biden, you better step back on issues of Taiwan. This is somewhat of a red line. And the way that the media is basically presenting Biden, that they want to have a conversation, yes, about Taiwan. They're still talking about human rights issues. They're also talking about cyber technologies, et cetera. What is the point of this meeting? And what I mean by that is, you know, Biden seemed to be the one who directed this meeting, to direct this virtual summit. What is he trying to get out of this? Is this just kind of like the meeting with Vladimir Putin where it's just communication? We just want to keep communication lines open? Or is there something deeper in this kind of communication between these two parties?
Okay, well, it's no secret that Joe Biden has continued Donald Trump administration's policy of decoupling economically from China and pivoting militarily towards the West Pacific to fight a future naval war to contain China basically off of their own coast, although that goes back as far as actually the Obama administration. Biden is very much continuing that. And I believe that what he's doing by engaging in this invitation for, you know, a virtual talk between him and the Chinese leader is to basically dictate the U.S.'s red lines, particularly when it comes to Taiwan and the South China Sea, but also, you know, towards Chinese economic practices versus American economic practices with the, you know, the ongoing trade war of tariffs and sanctions and so on, you know, but also broader Chinese influence, and in particular, Africa is a hot point, a flashpoint of tension between Chinese economic influence and U.S. military influence in the continent.
That all makes perfect sense. A couple things here. I just want to start with sort of the first thing you brought up there, the red lines as it regards to Taiwan specifically. A lot of the lines that have been crossed in the Western media, as the Western media has put it, by China when it comes to Taiwan, flying airplanes, sending naval craft in zones that they shouldn't be broadly. Now, some of this gets particularly, it's not murky, but some of it's particularly dishonest with the air defense identification zone, the ADIZ zone that we were talking about, where again, if China's flying craft over its own territory, over its own mainland, in a strip of land over its mainland, decades old, recognized as Taiwanese territory for some reason by the United States, not China, to be clear, if that's what the media is coming over, it seems like an arbitrary tripwire. So those can't be real red lines, which is where I'm going with my question. What do you think the real red lines actually are? If those aren't them, and you know that's what's been capturing a lot of attention, what do you think might be some slightly more esoteric causes for an actual war? Something that we might not be as aware of as these simple, whatever, you know, the ADIZ tripwires that we've been talking about. Mark.
Yeah, of course, China is not flying its airplanes anywhere where it shouldn't be, right? China is flying its airplanes in international airspace near, but not, you know, broaching the international real boundaries of Taiwan. If it was a state, which it is not a state, which even the U.S. policy, however grudgingly, admits that Taiwan is a separatist province of China, that it is ultimately part of China. However much de facto they are supporting Taiwanese separatism and independence, if you want to say. I believe that what Joe Biden is doing is actually pushing against China's red lines. And he is the the Taiwan-U.S. Relations Act, dating back to the 1970s, which the U.S. recognizes that Taiwan is part of China and says that it won't directly interfere there, but that it is pushing for political reconciliation as the preferred medium. And at the same time, while not establishing official relations with China, it basically announces its right to sell them arms, which has been ongoing and extremely large in terms of profitability, of course, for the U.S. military complex, but has de facto turned Taiwan into an anti-Chinese proxy U.S. military base off of China's coast to contain it. And China increasingly views that as a military threat, particularly to their economic lifelines. They are, dependent on maritime trade, bringing resources into the country and then shipping out finished products to the rest of the world. That's what they do. That's how they've grown their economy and keep domestic stability. The U.S., starting under Trump, but now pushing forward under Biden, is basically taking this deliberately, strategically ambiguous Taiwan policy and pushing it in a further direction of U.S. support for separatism / independence in Taiwan, while also being even more obtusely ambiguous about the fact that they're doing it. And we've learned in recent months that the U.S. now has troops, Marines, supposedly on a training mission in Taiwan, which is one of the things that is a red line for China. The U.S. is increasingly opening economic, cultural offices in Taiwan that are not official, but are increasingly becoming official or de facto. And there is an office of a relations exchange for the U.S. and Taiwan in Taiwan that has basically become the de facto U.S. embassy in Taiwan. And all of this with the now routine visits by U.S. politicians, senators, congressmen to Taiwan, is making China very angry. They view that as a breach of the Taiwan Relations Act, where the U.S. promised not to officially not to establish official relations with Taiwan. And the U.S. is continuing its parade of naval forces in the Taiwanese Straits and the South China Sea, basically right off China's coasts under what it calls Freedom of Navigation Act. Those are good. But if China flies its own planes off its own coast in international airspace, whatever Taiwan's not legally binding, self-declared, expansive air defense identification zone, which has no basis under any type of international law or body, that is bad. If China flies planes off of its own coast, bad. U.S. parades its naval forces off of China's coast on the other side of the West Pacific. That's good. That's the narrative they're trying to build here. And this is, the U.S. is really pushing hard to push China's red lines back and to establish their new red lines against China in Taiwan.
Will this be successful? And I guess this goes in two questions. What do you think the outcome of this one is going to be? Is this kind of like the Putin-Biden summit, where it seems that the main outcome is just that there's communication between the two sides, but nothing tangibly gets done? Or is there something else here where there is a belief that something could get done in some kind of beneficial way? Just listening to the way you're explaining this, it doesn't seem like there's anything beneficial coming out of this.
Yeah, it would be nice because, the ultimate downward trend of this increasing tensions, conflicts, stepping on red lines in Taiwan is a naval conflict between the two largest economic powers in the planet, both of them nuclear-armed countries. That would be bad, I think, for everyone except for certain political and military leaders in the U.S. who seem to want that, neocons and others. But unfortunately, I do not see signals from either side, either China or in the U.S. or its proxy support in Taiwan, for signaling any type of willingness to compromise on issues. As far as China is concerned, the U.S. is provoking them and changing the rules of the game. And from the U.S. side, it's, we were always ambiguous, and maybe we are changing the rules of the game, but you just better accept it. That doesn't leave a lot of hope for anything constructive coming out of this meeting, perhaps other than a clearing up of each other's positions to each other.
And hopefully that's productive in some way. But no, Mark, great explanation, great overview. We're going to go into a brief break. When we come back, we'll be talking again about Belarus, Poland, this migrant situation, also the threat, the prospect on Belarus's side of gas flowing through the country, getting shut off to the EU, as of course the EU heads into, by all accounts, a cold winter, dealing with energy issues as gas gets more expensive. We'll be getting into why that happened, recent developments, what this migrant situation between Belarus and the EU represents, what this means, what will happen with it going forward, all with Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. When we come back, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want the record.
Let's talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And we're joined with Mark Sloboda, international relations and security analyst. Mark, thank you for continuing to join us.
Shane, Jamarl, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I want to get into what's taking place right now between Belarus, Russia, and the European Union and Poland, where it seems that the European Union basically is standing beside Poland, despite the fact that Poland has taken on certain policies that run roughshod over the EU, I guess you want to call it the EU law. I mean, one of those things have to do with basically if you step foot into Europe, you have this ability to, at the very least, register for asylum, where Poland has basically changed their laws and has blown this particular policy off. And despite that, this is one of those things where the European Union is standing beside Poland on not wanting a huge number of refugees or immigrants from, let's say, other parts of the Middle East, basically going into Europe. And so what is taking place? What is the latest escalation on this? From my understanding, we had a situation where Alexander Lukashenko basically threatened to withhold gas going into Europe if there are any more sanctions that are basically applied to Belarus. Well, Putin basically put a knife in this pretty quickly, saying, we had conversations about this. This was not something we talked about, which means it's probably somewhat of a non-starter from jump. But what is going on? What's the latest conflict? And how is this, does this show any signs of abating in regards to the escalation between between Belarus and the European Union, specifically in this very specific case, Poland?
Yeah, Poland and Lithuania as well, because there's also the migrant issue on the border with them as well. And it has to be said, although the EU stakes out a rhetorical, values position on migrants and the right to claim asylum, at least to claim it. Whether they're given it is another matter. But the reality is that EU countries, I'm looking at Italy, Spain, and others, have been doing everything they can to push back migrants from being able to exercise those rights without any, action from the EU for a long period of time. Poland certainly isn't the first one to try to prevent migrants from entering their country. And, a big part of this is the rise of anti-immigrant nationalist politics that it has wide support among a lot of people and political parties in different countries in the EU, but is very out of bounds with the professed policy of the liberal EU technocratic elite. And that the UN High Commissioner for Refugees just spoke to that, in recent hours, saying that, as far as he's concerned, one of the main things that has led to this crisis is the demonization of migrants/asylum seekers within the EU. Within domestic politics in individual countries. That has led to the kind of media and political hysteria surrounding this event. But, more specifically, the origins of this crisis have to do with the EU, in particularly Poland and Lithuania, not accepting the outcome of last year's presidential election in Belarus, claiming it was rigged, supporting a by all accounts, extremely marginal pro-Western opposition candidate, and basically declaring her to be the real president of Belarus. They've been all involved supporting Belarusian opposition in staging protests in an attempt to overthrow the government. As far as the Belarusian government is concerned, it was an EU-sponsored regime change attempt, however ham-handed, against Lukashenko. That was followed when it failed by increasing rounds of sanctions to punish the Belarusian people into turning more strongly against Lukashenko. There were some individual sanctions as well, targeted sanctions, but then they turned to state companies and industries, and the attempt is to turn the people against the government. The Belarusian government has not looked favorably on that, obviously, and in their response, their counterattack to what they see as a hybrid and economic war by the EU on Belarus, the Belarusian government has engaged in their own asymmetric hybrid warfare back against the EU. And that involves simply saying, we are going to stop enforcing our borders with the EU. If migrants come to our country and, we might be doing some things to make it easier for them and handing them out some food while they're here, as long as their intention is to go on to the EU, they're free to, cross our borders and try to get into the EU. If that creates a political crisis within the EU, particularly Poland and Lithuania and others, and they try to beat these migrants back with brutal military force, well, that just shows further hypocrisy of the EU values. It is a cynical type of hybrid counterattack, but from the Belarusian government, it's no less cynical than, an illegal economic warfare via sanctions or regime change attempts. And it's nastiness all the way around. And at the same part, most of these migrants, of course, they generally want to get to the EU. Most of them come from areas where EU member states' armed forces have been involved, as sidekicks alongside the U.S., destabilizing numerous countries, particularly Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and others. And a large numbers of these migrants currently there, that have made their way to Belarus. And yes, I think Belarus has made it a little bit easier for them to get there. They're Kurds. A lot of them are Kurds. And there are, of course, there are a lot of young men, but there's also families and children and women and pregnant women and so on. And it's all turning, winter is coming, and it's all turning into a really nasty scenario. And the Belarusian government is not letting up, and is refuses to return to the enforcement of the borders, saying that, well, with our sanctions warfare, our border guards have to concentrate on other things because of the economic war that you're waging against us. In all of this, he's actually taking a page from NATO's own Turkish leader Erdogan, who engaged in economic blackmail of the EU by pulling the same thing with migrants, allowing them to flow into southern EU countries like Bulgaria and so on, and demanding billions of dollars from the EU to keep them within Turkey and support them. Whereas, in Belarus, that has been brought up, but that's really just trolling. It's basically a demand that the EU stop its sanctions against Belarus.
I mean, that makes perfect sense on their end, and you're bringing up Erdogan. The difference, I would say, with Turkey, one main one, well, two. One marginal that I'll come back to, which is Turkey's right between the Syrian civil war, the proximate source of all these refugees, and the EU.
And deeply involved in it.
And that's the second one that I was coming to. Back in 2011, of course, Syrian civil war, it's not just the Turkish government condemning the Syrian government. They were supporting, the FSA. They were supporting these dissidents. They were supporting, in other words, the conflict that led to these refugees, and still are. To this point,
they're occupying large portions of Syria militarily.
And contrary, of course, with Belarus. But I want to come back to the geographic location here. I've heard arguments, and I want to get from you the facts, Mark. Was Lukashenko flying these refugees out in order to cause this crisis? What's going on there?
I haven't. He's not deliberately, filling up planes with migrants. Saying,
That's what I heard alleged last week.
Yeah. That is what is being alleged, but it's never done with any details. If you notice, he has basically made it clear that he will not defend that border, right? And that gives refugees in this countries that already have intentions of trying to get into the EU say, now's our chance. And while there's no direct evidence that he is filling up planes, there is some evidence that there are basically busing services helping them once they're in Belarus get to the border. A lot of that might be private enterprise, and that actually seems to be the case. But the government certainly isn't doing anything to stop it either. And the government is helping the refugees with providing at least a minimal amount of food and some wood, evidently, that they can burn to try to keep warm. It's not a good situation for people on that border. And all the time he's mocking the EU during this. But, it's a little bit, it's still cynical, and it is still a manipulation of sorts, but I don't believe that it is quite direct as a lot of the Western media is making it out to be, but that makes it a lot easier to explain to people from their perspective.
I want to move a little bit over to an issue that's been taking place in Ethiopia. This issue has been pretty wild to me. Shane and I have been covering it for over a year. And what you've found, despite the fact that the TPLF is the one that basically instigated this conflict, after being in charge of the country for, I think, 27 years, they didn't necessarily want to give it up to democratic control. You have Western media that's basically taking this propagandistic tact as if Ethiopia or Eritrea is somehow to blame. They've been instigating sanctions, and not just that, threatening even more sanctions, even using terms like genocide or ethnic cleansing in relation to what has been taking place over there. My question boils down to, what does the West expect to get out of this? I mean, is it really just they had this kind of military contract or military security apparatus in place with all of these various countries in the West, and then once you get a democratic order coming into play, that they still want those previous relationships back because of what was there prior? Or is there an expectation that they're going to get something out of the TPLF either coming into power, or for that matter, TPLF splitting off from Ethiopia in and of itself proper? What's going on with this? This has been somewhat confusing in regards to the level of propaganda they've been putting out on this issue. It's been intense.
Yeah, this is a really complex conflict. It is ethno-religious, political, nationalist, right? It's got all kinds of factors. And of course, the U.S., with its newfound support of the TPLF, which it once viewed as an enemy, and its antecedents going back to the Cold War, because they are left nationalist and have Marxist origins, much like the Kurds that the U.S. ended up supporting in Iraq and Syria. It must be said, it's amazing how these things completely turn around. But the U.S. does nothing geopolitical like this without something to gain geopolitically out of it. The Tigray region is primarily Orthodox Christian. And it is, if you want to consider it, an ethno-religious minority, but the TPLF has become the single leading political force within the country because the political forces are more divided in the rest of the country. They ruled the country for a number of years from 91 to after they overthrew a dictatorship to 2018. They were removed from power in disputed election then. Elections have since been pushed back by the new government under the excuse of the COVID pandemic. The Tigray region held their own elections, declared their own elections, and the government sent their forces to try to clear it up. I believe that what the U.S. sudden found support for the TPLF is they hope to have either through the TPLF seizing power or forcing compromise between the government and the TPLF. They seek to push Chinese influence out of Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa there in general. And that's the U.S.'s primary concern. Ethiopia is the second most populous African country, and they've had one of the fastest growing economic growth rates in the world up until the COVID pandemic. That's not to say they don't have a lot of economic problems. And there isn't really, there's obviously, it's a nasty war in Africa and a civil conflict and an ethno-religious nationalist conflict. So it's nasty, and there's war crimes and atrocities being committed on all sides. But U.S. claims of ethnic cleansing seem to be really overblown and part of their broader geopolitical goals. They either hope to force the Ethiopian government to they're using the TPLF as leverage against them, or if the TPLF gains power, they then expect the TPLF to be more beholden for them support, and they hope to turn them against China and Chinese economic influence in the country.
And that's not going to work out. But also part of it, another side of the equation here, and please briefly just mark over time a little bit, with the port in Djibouti. Ethiopia is a landlocked country. Djibouti, I remember years ago when I didn't know anything about the Belt and Road program, I remember hearing about Djibouti and China's investments in it, just peripherally paying attention. That was a big thing. It still is. And again, Ethiopia, landlocked country, their main import-export port is Djibouti. That naturally gives China power over Ethiopia. And so partly maybe do you see this as simply the U.S., we can't let that happen. We can't let that happen. So let's do whatever we can to get in the good graces of whoever's in charge, including if that means overthrowing this guy that the West just gave a Nobel Peace Prize to, even though it's not in the best interest of this country, just because we realize they're probably going to go the way of the Chinese. They're probably going to go with China because it would be in their best interest to do so. Is that kind of how you see this playing out, Mark?
Yeah, the issue of Djibouti and the ports there and their importance to the Ethiopian economy is very important, although must be say that China has also invested a lot of money in infrastructure and development support for Ethiopia as well. And previously, neither the government now nor the TPLF has been hostile to China. The U.S. would hope to gain that out of this. Yeah. And again, China is expanding their influence in Africa economically. The U.S. doesn't have that capability, so they resort to what they're good at, meddling, regime change, and their military presence. And, they're using that to their advantage in casting some degree of support behind the TPLF in this. They hope to make geopolitical gains against China out of this conflict.
Mark, thank you for joining us. Great conversation.
Thanks for having me.
That was Mark Sloboda. For those listening, international relations and security analyst. Follow him on Twitter at MarkSloboda1. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Going into a break, we'll be coming back taking your calls as we close out today's show. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Taking your calls when we come back. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Let's go to Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
Thanks for taking my call, gentlemen. First, I'd like to say hashtag free Julian Science, free Dunguzer, and hands off Haiti. This is about the Julian Science case I'm calling in about, which I caught y'all show to the end. I don't know if y'all brought it up, but I think y'all did. The New York Times had brought out the post over the weekend. I think it was Saturday. They wrote an article about what happened in Syria. But guns in Syria in 2009, May the 18th, I think it was.
Mm-hmm. The airstrike.
Mm-hmm. 2019, yeah.
Killed exactly. Killed 64 people and had a whistleblower that came out about it, Colonel Kozak, I think is his name, came out about it, and basically was talking about it as a war crime. He took 64 people on the heels of 10 people that was killed. The evidence came out like 2 months ago about some people that was killed in the airstrike. So back-to-back articles. That's a good thing that you have these news organizations is printing this stuff where it's not. Well, we're not always relying on WikiLeaks. But it shows that it shows the deep state that they have all other news organizations willing to promote truth and tell the truth. And also, Kathleen Johnson came out with an article dealing with this article that came out, talking about how important it is. Oh Lord, here we go. She was basically talking about how important it is to free Julian Assange from what's going on. U.S. cover-up of Syria massacre shows the dangers of the Assange president.
Mm-hmm.
The New York Times had published a very solid investigative report on the U.S. military cover-up in 2009 massacre. So, by prosecuting Julian Assange, they're trying to send a signal to all the journalists around the world not to do anything about it. The thing is, they can't be afraid because we're in a crucial time where we need people to stand up and speak the truth. We got a war that can kick off between the U.S. and China, so we need all the reporters to stand up and tell the truth about what's going on with that. And AI, his name is AI Wee, the
artist.
He's the artist. He came out on PBS in support of Julian Assange. You have different people coming out in support of Julian Assange, which is a good thing. But yeah, so that massacre would happen in Syria, and what the colonel says is almost like he said basically like a war crime.
Yep.
I don't know how the U.S. going to wiggle its way out of that. You know what I'm saying, by saying it was justified. I don't know.
We're not going to talk about it. Yeah, we might. Well, but it's so much later that and the story that you're referencing in the New York Times is about how they didn't want to talk about it and covered it up and kept shifting it around. And in the room, you can quote, "Who dropped that?" A confused analyst typed, "We just dropped on 50 women and children." It turns out it was more than that.
Yeah.
But that was the whole story there is that they wanted, well, not the whole story, but part of the story, a big part of it is they wanted to suppress it. They just killed all these innocents, and they wanted to keep that from getting out. And Tarif, I completely understand where you're going to Assange. Assange, as the leak collector, as the WikiLeaks collector of leaks, from all these intelligence institutions. The Vault 7 release, if you take any different department with all of its problems and all the contents of everything it wants to sweep under the rug, imagine two worlds. One in which you air that stuff out and those institutions have a chance to reflect on what they got wrong. Things leak and they're forced to face the consequences and they have to change their behavior, else they just face leak after leak after leak. And so all of a sudden you get another church committee. Or in another universe, Assange is in Belmarsh, he's put in prison, nobody chooses to do these leaks, and they're never forced to confront anything. Well, on the one hand, it's easier for them, but on the other hand, they keep committing these atrocities. They keep committing these abuses. And I can't help but think that even for them as an institution, that's going to be bad, let alone morally what it means for the country, let alone morally what it means for the world. And just, should we be doing this kind of thing? I can't even help but think that for these institutions, and we're talking with John Kiriakou, former CIA case officer, he agreed, if these institutions don't have a chance to learn what they're actually doing, and when it goes wrong, then they're never going to improve. And guess what that does for morale? Guess what that does for consistency up and down the organization? My point is, however, whichever way you look at it, I feel like I completely understand why you're associating this with Assange, and I agree on that one.
Yeah.
Tarif. We have another caller? Let's go to Malik, calling in from D.C. I hear you had a question for me, Malik. What's on your mind this morning? Again, Malik.
I did, and I did hear your comments after I got off, and I understand in terms of arguing the merits of the evidence of that case as it's presented, but I did want to present something to you. I would assume that you and Jamarl are, you're somewhat friends and colleagues. Imagine if you guys are traveling in this country in a region where, let's say, the locals are not necessarily that friendly to people who look like Jamarl. I would assume that as the white guy in the group, that you would feel protective of your friend and colleague. Right?
Yeah. No, totally.
Case?
Totally.
Okay. So juxtapose that with someone like Kyle Rittenhouse and his friends. The reason that you would feel protective in that situation and would step forward in a situation like that in defense of Jamarl is because you know that as a white man in America, that you do have a certain freedom and a democratic space that maybe in that particular situation, Jamarl doesn't have. So Kyle Rittenhouse and his group of friends, that level of military adventurism that many white men in this country are allowed to engage in is the purview of white men. And it is generally understood, and to leave that out of the discussion of this case, regardless of the trial itself, and what needs to be argued in the evidence as it's being presented, for us outside of that arena to not mention that and not address those issues because it may seem pedestrian, I think would be wrong.
No, pedestrian wouldn't be the word that I'd use. And I don't know, I'll think about that. One thing that comes to mind, though, is that like the new Black Panther Party, I'm sure you're familiar with them. They go out, they'll do these public demonstrations, and they'll be armed, like the old Black Panther Party was.
It's not 3 of them.
What'd you say? It's not 3 of them. It's a lot of them out there.
Yeah, I don't know how big it is, but I didn't think it was that big. I thought it was small. The most recent version of the Black Panther Party.
Quite a few people. Dozens of people out with demonstrations. Now, but I don't know what that means, and I'm not saying, well, that could be the exception that proves the rule. I'm just saying that also exists, but I will grant the general point that this kind of thing and the whole Proud Boys Boogaloo thing and it being a white thing, I don't know, but at the same time, Malik, say that some of these, and I don't like any of those movements in particular, but like, can you make the argument that those are at the same time that some of them might be like white-leaning or white supremacist? Maybe. And even then, Proud Boys headed by Enrique Tarrio, like a Cuban-American black dude, isn't that, I don't know. Malik, you still there?
Well, I'm still here. I would make the point, there are several instances of open carry protests on the part of black people in this country. And I wouldn't say most, but in many of those cases, the police show up and disarm those men, regardless of and you can see there are tons of YouTube videos and videos on Twitter.
And you can see it in this case, too, in your favor with Rittenhouse, and he goes to turn himself into the police, and they're like giving him water bottles and just telling him to go home. I will completely buy that. Yeah, if a black dude were to do that, I'm not sure they would respond the same way. So I don't want to shut that side of the conversation down at all. That wasn't my intent. My point was the people he killed were white. So if you're bringing up a racial component, I don't see that, there's a point to which that point makes sense, and there's a point where it doesn't make sense. I didn't know exactly where you're going, but I think I hear you, Malik. We're going into a break. Thank you, everybody, for calling in, for listening, and for joining us this morning. You've been listening to Fault Lines. Be back tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Eastern. See you on the other side, folks.